Well, good afternoon and welcome to the City of Tempe's work study session for March 1st, 2018 here at Nahiri E. Mitchell Government Center. The first section is the call to the audience for the issue review session. Audience members have up to 3 minutes to discuss any of the items listed on this agenda. If you'd like to speak on the item, could you please follow the speaker's card, or you can get my attention and I will call your name. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to speak on any of the items on the issue review session? You may do so at this time. None? There's no one here to talk about pigeons? Seeing none, I'll close that portion. Next is item 2A, which is our Urban Core Master Plan. Chad, you can come forward. I think we have some guests as well.
Evening, Mayor, Council. Hello. Lots of paper for relatively little work for me tonight, but Chad Weaver, Community Development Director. We have before you a number of items on the agenda tonight. A and B will be a bit seamless perhaps as we have the same team working on them. I have with me at the moment to my left Josh Romer and Chris Hall. Roger Eastman will join them in my seat in a moment, and they will be doing the presentations on both the Urban Core and the Affordable Housing Impact Statement. Included within the Urban Core, of course, is the transit portion, the TOD as well. So, okay. A couple of things that I want to cover just to set the table. One of the things that we've heard from a few folks as we've been doing some public outreach is, why is this plan happening? You all can probably think back to the couple of meetings where you gave us direction, allowed us to proceed, and nothing has really changed from that standpoint, but just in way of reminder, the overall effort, if I had to encapsulate it very quickly, which is difficult to do, would be to consolidate all the plans, visions, experiences that we've had over a number of years and devise more specific and finite guidance to accommodate all the predicted growth in a high quality manner that the City of Tempe would be proud of, essentially. So towards that end, to this point, we have done a current state analysis. We have done some objectives and visioning, and we have a number of phases left to go. I know some folks have wondered if there were more opportunities for input, more work to come, and there certainly is. We have scenario visioning, we have draft master planning, strategies, implementation, and adoption, several phases over the next several months. And each of those will have the opportunity for significant public input. So with that said, tonight...
Can you first introduce
Sure.
Who's up here with you?
We did. This was Chris Hall and this is Josh Romer. Okay. And they will be doing the presentation tonight. And again, Roger Eastman will join them in just a moment.
And just to reiterate for the members of the public and those that are watching, this is a work in progress. This is only the beginning steps of a long process to really identify the urban core and some of the questions that you haven't before us. And I know that was presented last night at the forum.
Yes, exactly. There are a number of phases yet to come. Some of the input we've gotten is that there wasn't enough opportunity, and maybe they were thinking we're reaching the end. Unfortunately, we're not. I know we all want some answers to move forward with, but there is definitely some process left to go. So the one thing I want to leave you with tonight is that there's a lot of information here, and it would be easy to appreciate it and let it go by, but we want to be clear that at the end of all the process that I just outlined for you, there will be a direction proposed. And so with that in mind, we want you tonight to ask any questions and provide any input that you think might be necessary to set us up for success in the end, so that you can make what will be a somewhat finite decision about the direction of the city at that point. So this just isn't a check-in. This is, real engagement here in terms of the stages that we've reached up till now and setting us for success going forward. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Chris and let Roger come join you.
Okay, thanks. So again, my name is Chris Hall. I'm with SOM. I'm an urban planner and consultant on the Urban Core Master Planning process, and I'm joined by Josh Romer, an economist with BAE Economics, and Roger Eastman, who is our zoning expert on looking at the Transportation Overlay District, and he's with Lisa Weiss Consulting. I think what we wanted to do tonight, we wanted to give you a quick overview of the work that's been done, already across the different work streams. We have been looking at market growth and potential, and we are looking out to 2040. So, there are it's long range, and there are potentially some larger considerations on the table. We wanted to take you through our review of the Transportation Overlay District, which is 12 years old now and has had a lot of success, but it's now the time to kind of revisit and rethink and refine and upgrade with best practices as they stand today. And then we've got some ideas about where we think growth may go in the future based on where infrastructure exists today, where it may exist in the future, where transit may go, where the market is moving, and then also in terms of where land is available. So we wanted to kind of show that to you. I think we wanted also to say at the beginning that the emphasis of this work is on places that will grow and change in the future. And we've heard an enormous amount through our consultations and initial conversations about the importance of existing neighborhoods and a really strong concern and awareness of the importance of preserving what's valued within the city already and the existing fabric and its existing character and identity and image. So we kind of wanted to say that right at the beginning, that we're very conscious of that while we're also talking about what the future direction of growth may be. So table of contents, what we wanted to talk about, just as an overview and introduction, reminder, this is the urban core area that we're looking at, which is the north of the city, north of the tracks, essentially from Hardy to 101, encompassing both sides of Town Lake as well. We have been through a process of looking back through previous plans back to kind of Chad's question, why are we doing this? We have a series of plans, and I think this process is about taking a lot of those aspirations and policies, moving them forward, and then also looking at how they get resolved on the ground in particular places, because there are questions about how things actually translate into what happens on the ground, and that's what we'll be working through as we go forward. But I'm not going to go through all of these points, but there's clear kind of ideas about what the future of Tempe should be in the urban core. And on one hand, it's aspirations around growth, the diversity of the economy, active housing market, focusing growth in particular locations, particularly around hubs. At the same time, there's an enormous investment in the idea of quality around preserving neighborhoods, respecting existing character, and then thinking about how things work in the future. Walkability, open space, highest quality development, but then also reflecting what Tempe is. And as an overall summary, and maybe I'll just headline some of this and we'll move into kind of what the detail is. The city is changing within the region. It's got a very strong role and potential. We've had a look at the potential growth into the future, and it is significant in terms of projected or potential residential and employment growth. There are then questions about exactly where that goes and what shape that takes. There are a number of areas where any future growth has to be sensitively related to existing neighborhoods. And there are some places where we think there should be further investigation, because those are the places where there will be probably the most likely proposals for future development, and this process will provide guidance and advice and a framework for making decisions in the future. There is a set of questions, again, I won't go through all 10 of these, but there's a set of questions around what the nature of growth is, what the mix is between housing, jobs, what types of housing, what types of jobs. There are questions around ideas we've got for updating the Transportation Overlay District, which potentially means different uses, different activities, different design requirements. And then also we've identified some areas for further investigation. I think we want to kind of get some input and hear your ideas about what you think the most important places to actually do some more detailed planning and design work around. Just in terms of the market analysis, the population today is 43,000 people, 26,000 of whom are students. There's 35,000 jobs in place today. 14,000 of those are office-based. In terms of, there are some unique characteristics about the population. It's very significantly impacted by younger people, which is, of course, related to the student population. That also rolls into household income, and as we'll hear later from Josh, rolls into what the requirements are for affordable housing, either from long-term residents and kind of separating out what the requirements are from long-term residents versus those who are students. Recent growth across all domains in terms of population, housing, and jobs growth. What we've also seen is much of the housing growth in this area has been in multifamily. It's been almost a 50% increase in multifamily units since 2008. However, interestingly, the rental growth hasn't been as strong. There's some vacancy, which may reflect the churn that you get relating to a student population. Office growth has been significant, so there's a new regional role. You know, Tempe is playing a new role in the region in terms of its office focus. Retail has been relatively stable. The amount of retail space has been relatively stable, but occupancy is good, vacancy is low, but there haven't been kind of major recent retail developments the last 5 years. In terms of movement, there's an interesting pattern emerging that there are people coming to the area from a much wider area in the region, so people coming to the urban core. And then people who live here actually tend to commute shorter distances, which may relate to the jobs that are present here or may relate to the light rail.
Excuse me, I have a question on that slide. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and it says this, so 97% of the workers in the urban core leave the urban core for their jobs?
97% of the workers with jobs in the study area come from outside.
From outside.
Oh, okay.
You've heard me say that we're the largest importer of jobs per capita.
Right, right.
That's basically ties. I mean, we are.
Okay, yeah, I had it backwards. I thought those people living there then commuted outside of the area for their jobs. You're saying that they come inside.
Second paragraph.
Right.
refers to
Okay,
that.
I got it. Thank you.
So a marker of success. And these are projections that we've worked out. Josh in particular has been working on these in terms of potential population growth in the urban core area, household growth, jobs growth, and interesting dynamics where the number of households potentially grows by 95%. Some of those will be single person households, but that's sort of the demand level. The jobs growth potentially grows. We're showing 47.5%, but around 50% jobs growth in the area. So an interesting dynamic of kind of potentially faster household growth than jobs growth. So that's just a kind of a scene setter in terms of some of the numbers. We've also looked at transportation overlay districts, the diagram here of what the boundaries of that are today. And I think our position is, our understanding is that it's been very successful. It's brought a range of residential and commercial development. It's focused it. It's organized it in a particular kind of way. And it's been embraced as well. And there's a very strong connection between use of the light rail and the type of development that has happened around it. But there are issues. It hasn't been always successful in managing transitions between new development and existing neighborhoods. There are some questions people have about the bulk and form of development. There are parking issues, on-site parking and off-site parking. And there are questions about how do you create usable open space if you are developing each site individually and making decisions on a one-by-one basis. How do you then make kind of decisions around the whole neighborhood? And I think that's what we're interested in the next stage is how do you look at some of those collective issues? We've also seen a lot of vacancy on ground floors. There was a requirement to provide ground floor commercial space. I think we've learned this nationally. This isn't a Tempe issue. We're seeing this nationally, that we need to be much more focused about where we ask for retail on ground floors and allow other uses to come to the ground as well. And then we've got to design them.
With that being said, though, what are some of the tools that we could use to prevent that we get the ground floor right? Because I see a lot of ground floors within a TOD area that are completely vacant still.
Yeah.
They've been vacant for quite some time, some for a decade.
Yeah. So our ideas are that you broaden the uses that are allowed to go in there. You're not so specific about the type of retail. You potentially allow housing to happen on the ground floor. But if you bring that housing to the ground floor, then you need different kinds of design requirements for housing residential at that ground floor right next to the sidewalk works. So that may get into questions of setbacks, landscaping, protective design measures of the ground floor. It would be a different kind of response.
When you say broaden uses for retail, like, can you give me an example? I mean, we're pretty open.
Gem Studios. Yeah, Mayor and Council, Roger Eastman with Lisa Weiss Consulting, helping you with the TOD. Well, we could expand the list of uses to include, for example, gyms and fitness facilities. You want a use that's active so people can see inside and see what's going on, and you often find people on their treadmills right in front of the window. So there's one use that we could add to the list.
Are we currently preventing that? I didn't think we are.
I thought you were, but
Okay.
other uses so could include expanding the availability of uses so you don't have to go through a conditional use permit. Make it easier to get a particular use in place. And I don't remember off my head which of the uses you do require with a use permit, but there are a number that you could easily require. You don't allow big box stores in the TOD. And arguably you could, because you could have a fairly large big box store provided that the outside of the store was lined with smaller retail. So you could have the bigger use behind a line of building, a parking structure built into it, and not prohibit it and actually allow it. And you'll see across the country a number of facilities that have been designed this way and they work very successfully.
Okay. Yes, Randy, then Lauren.
I'm still on the recent population and employment trend slide. I was just wondering, sorry, this is all very interesting to me, and I was looking through it last night and had some questions. I see that, since 2010, the population has grown by about 9,000 people, and the jobs, we've created about 3,000 more jobs in the study area. Is there anywhere that says where our housing supply was in 2010 and what it is now? I assume that's grown as well. I would just like to see how much it's grown in comparison to the other numbers.
Yeah, good evening. So Josh Romer with BAE Urban Economics. I don't believe that we have a slide that specifically speaks to that, but it's definitely in the report. We can definitely follow up with that information.
Okay, thank you.
Lauren?
Then in the key findings, the TOD challenges, design and development issues. And this sort of relates to the not enough shade, but that perhaps there's not enough green space or softer space to contrast with the hard space.
Yep.
And I know you talk about a solution in the next slide, so it seems like you should add that. It seems to me if we're looking, just thinking in terms of green versus gray infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I think this speaks to the point that, and this is an example where there may be multiple sites that, as they come through the process now, might be considered individually, but as we go forward into kind of master planning and looking at particular areas, what actually is the open space that works not just for new development but also for the existing residential community as well. So thinking about this more holistically as opposed to just having regulations for individual development decisions.
Well, and the opportunity for green infrastructure to help with flooding and issues like that as they happen.
Yeah, and exactly, because that's a point where we're looking at it collectively and holistically and looking across multiple sites rather than having every individual site trying to solve its own issues. Okay. And then just in terms of the TOD districts and the transportation overlay districts, and this also relates to kind of the master planning areas we may consider later. There's this notion of kind of how do you transition, and it's a question of the design and physical transition from kind of high density along main corridors down to single family districts, but it's also kind of a housing type, a housing opportunity transition as well. And there is quite a strong notion of the missing middle. You go at the moment going from kind of one type of housing down to another type, and not much of a transition in terms of the typology. And this is something which is kind of emerging within the industry overall. And we think this is something that we would want to explore in the next stage in more detail, is where the missing middle housing could potentially go, how it relates to some of the transportation corridors that we discussed.
Exactly. Nothing else.
And for
Lauren?
address historic preservation for key properties. So as part of this, you're going to outline those key properties and work with Historic Preservation Commission on identifying those.
Yeah, and I think we've got to kind of understand where those exist and explore examples of how you would address that relationship. Because again, that's something that the Transportation Overlay District doesn't kind of specifically do. So it's one of those areas you want to investigate, along with thinking about what's the actual context of the neighborhoods that this corridor goes through. And it's different. It's different through different components and parts of the corridor.
I just want to throw in there, like right in the heart of the downtown core is the Harrington Burkett House, and that is going to be such an important house to preserve. And we don't currently own it, so it's an issue that's going to, at some point, come before us.
Yeah, okay. And then, you know, around maybe some of the more obvious design details in terms of getting the ground floor right, making sure it's activated, coming back to the questions about how we activate those. And also, it's not just about the front of the building. You know, what's interesting is, I think what we've heard from neighborhood residents is some of the concerns about what they see on the corridors is they're looking at the back of buildings. So understanding the design quality of the back of buildings is important, and the end walls as well, because that's what people who are there day to day experience. That's how they experience new development. So some ideas about thinking about all sides of the building, not just the front facades. So yeah, again, this is Transportation Overlay District today. And what we've also started to do is think about, with the advent of the streetcar, does this map of the Transportation Overlay District change? We've also got some ideas about rethinking the notion of hubs. You know, the general plan talks about hubs. There's a lot of emphasis on hubs as a way to organize the life of the city. So does that mean that we should have a different idea about concentrating particularly around stations, and that the overlay district has very kind of specific requirements in the immediate area of stations, and potentially has impacts around stops on the streetcar. And then also picking up the streetcar and light rail are different sorts of systems. They have different numbers of people who use them. So it's not going to be the same rules. How do we, and as a next step, I think we want to investigate what those different requirements may be in different areas. Okay.
Before you go there, I just want to point out that, you know, we mentioned how old the the TOD has technically been involved for 12 years. I'm very open to re-examining that, and I appreciate the work that you've been doing on this. But it's important that not only are we designing for the benefit of our community, but we're also making sure that we need to design, look at the TOD that for people that are living here right now regarding future growth. You know, we talked about the numbers earlier of the size of the impact, and we have TOD places in place, but then we also need to make sure that we're looking at the existing people that live in around currently at TOD. And you also talked about the different scalability and size of buildings. You've seen our city, I'm sure you've been out to some of the TOD areas, and you've seen some of the development goes up against single-family homes. Yep. The land is very tight, so any suggestions you can have with that, we did talk about that. I know we were worried about the massing on Farmer and Fifth as it relates to single-family as it transitions into the downtown area, and that we have the same challenges on Apache that we're looking at with some of the development, that we're looking at the ground floor. I mean, you've seen the vacant ground floors that we see just right down the street. To me, I don't know why that's vacant still, but it is. And I'll be honest with you, I'm glad, to my knowledge, I don't think we would prohibit any type of use, as long as, you know, barring something that's not proper. But I mean, I find it hard to believe that we would deny having a gym there or something of that nature, because it just doesn't fit with the overall reaching. I mean, we've adaptive reuse model ordinances for our, you know, existing buildings. We're trying to be creative to get individuals inside these spaces. So it's kind of interesting. There's got to be something else going on there that is not activating it.
I was going to say, to that point, I mean, we've always had the issue, we used the corner of McClintock and Apache with the ground floor retail on that. We encouraged to get more ground floor retail, but it's the property owner that is not willing.
Exactly.
So how do we bridge those gaps? Because I could see that on various other corners where I'm like, you know, the rents are high or they're too high, but they'd rather do nothing to it instead of taking some sort of rent.
Councilman Granville?
I think to that point, I think there's a couple of things that we've talked about in passing, but maybe not directly addressed related to that. Number one is residential, right? Like if there was just more people living in downtown, the commercial takes care of itself, right? You get more people in the coffee shop, you get more people at the dry cleaner, you get more people at the grocery store, but it's a, you know, it's a chicken and an egg issue, right? Like, you don't want to move downtown until there's a grocery store, but there's a grocery store. And I think there's a second part to that, that for the Apache McClintock one, so that was done, if I recall correctly, I wasn't on council at the time, but I think that was done with a tax incentive, with some sort of chiplet or some tax abatement. We could tell people, look, a condition of this is you having this occupied. We don't care what it's occupied with, right? Just a coffee shop, an anything, occupy. And if you don't, that's a condition of your chiplet. So maybe the rent is zero. Maybe the rent is zero and you even pay to build it out. And then you put someone in there, or you put an incubator space in there. Or if you're unable to fill it, you allow us as a city to use it rent-free for, you know, for like heat sink or any sort of tech incubator space. But we just, for whatever reason, I think we didn't know what we didn't know, right? We assumed it would fill. And now I think we just know that we need to put bigger sticks and bigger carrots.
And to your, sorry, Mayor. And to your point, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, you know, I think we talk about these incentives and we talk about ideas, but how are we executing them, or how can we execute them? I think, you know, months ago, and I know we recently tried to get it, was Dr. Stapps to come in and talk about urban planning and the core and development and philosophy of the past, present, and the future, and where trends are going and where rents are going and retail is going. I think that would have been advantageous for us to have had that conversation probably before this conversation possibly, or even maybe afterwards, but we apparently dropped the ball on that.
Well, I don't think we could entirely, because if you look at the projects that we are moving forward, we're requiring.
Well, yeah, we are.
We are
Now
requiring certain spaces to be filled, and if not, we're looking for different types of uses. So that, as we move forward, but this is like a work in progress, and we move forward. I'm curious with your expertise, to give us some ideas and insights, because to my knowledge, like I said earlier, I didn't think that we would prohibit any type of business going in there. Chad can tell me if I'm wrong, because it's important to get those spaces filled. I mean, we have every intent, we'll be flexible within the law, obviously, or certain types of uses that aren't proper. But in terms of, I think you guys know what I'm referring to, but I honestly think that we have every intent to continue to incentivize, and it's going to touch a little bit on affordable housing in a minute, but it continue to incentivize people moving in to activate these spaces. I mean, we've done that throughout the city with, you know, we helped get Food City on Apache, which is in the TOD area, and it's a good market. We have Whole Foods right here on the corner of Ashton University on a streetcar route with living units above it, which is, I think, fits exactly what you guys are talking about.
Yeah.
That fits in the model, and we were requiring them to make sure it's a grocery store. So all that works. We're going down that direction. But we still have some existing businesses that are on College and right by our transit center. And then, as Councilman Navarro mentioned, on McClintock and Apache, what can we do to help? And we can try to revisit with those property owners. Councilman Randall.
To add on to Joel's point, because I think it's a great one. I think, you know, you guys were talking about, well, the issue with the commercial not being vacant is we'll just let them use residential. I think in my opinion, it's kind of the reverse. The reason there's not commercial on the first floor is because we don't have enough residential, right? With 20% more residential, the commercial fills, right? Or 30%, or whatever that number is, it's a tipping point for it. And so when we're looking at vacant commercial, you just have to keep adding residential. And so if you look at someplace like San Francisco, which I'm not saying Tempe should ever become San Francisco, but certainly the downtown area, that's been our model, right? Residential, commercial, office on top, commercial only on the first floor, so that you have a contiguous storefront, so you now have a walkable street. And as soon as you give up that storefront on the street to residential, I question if you ever get that back.
But I mean, let's be real. Today's different than it was even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and the bricks and mortars, they're hurting. We have the Amazons of the world. I mean, it's a different world for us. So whatever we can do to help us be creative when it comes to that retail space, it may be a different type of retail, not you know, something we would think of that would fit in there. We can only have so many Starbucks and Dutch Brothers. Maybe more Dutch Brothers, because
Apparently you can't have too many.
You can't have too many of those. But it's just a comment. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mayor, Council, if I may, one of the things you've heard from some of your residents is they don't feel like there's enough retail that supports their neighborhood commercial needs. And I think there's a gap there, and we heard some really creative ideas in terms of incentives. So if we can get more retail that actually serves the neighborhood,
Right.
rather than the students in the buildings that live above them, I think we'll be heading in the right direction here.
So,
Joel?
just my question to that is, and that's coming with the grocery store concept, where the grocers wouldn't put a grocery store in here because it just didn't have enough house
Enough
tops.
rooftops.
Yeah, rooftops. And so I'm like, okay, so is there enough of the rooftops to help sustain those retail places? So I know what you're saying. I agree with it. And then there's a little, I don't know. because do they, I know it's like my personal opinion, I want that and that there. But I might be the only one that's going to go there with 3 of my friends, and that's about it. So it's a real tough concept.
Go ahead, sorry.
I wasn't going to say anything. No.
No, I mean, let's continue.
Okay.
Okay. So the next piece of the process is kind of stepping back to the whole urban core level and looking at, well, what might the shape be in the future? And the question on the table here is not one of let's approve this shape. It's more a question of where should we be focusing our efforts when we get down to the next level of planning and design guidance. So let's skip past this. So again, the urban core, what makes it up in terms of like the major functional districts of university, downtown, industrial, residential, then looking at kind of in a finer grain at some of the individual neighborhoods and homeowner association areas, understanding that fabric, just skip back one. And then, what are the influences that really shape the area? This is some of the kind of key elements around the existing transit and bikes, so the light rail, and also in construction now, the streetcar. And what are if we just kind of ignore the existing overlay districts, what are the areas that might actually be most influenced by that live kind of transit element and those kind of focal points around individual stations, which is where you might actually focus retail, and then in between stations you kind of have different rules, and understanding that the streetcar has a different function. Its stops tend to be closer together, so it's less concentric rings than it is kind of a zone or a corridor of influence. And then, there are some ideas for emerging concepts around the future of transportation as well. So emerging ideas about what if the streetcar continues east on Rio Salado in the future? What if we look at rural roads and kind of enhance public transportation there in terms of, future potential for bus routes or high-capacity bus, and other components which also start to shape kind of where things may go in the future. So, if you take the same approach of there's an area of influence around these future transportation investments, it starts to kind of suggest a pattern for the future. And then, of course, there's highways as well. So it's not just about transit, as we all know. The huge numbers of people still use highways as their primary mode of getting around.
97% of the people that come into urban core, how do they get here?
So we know. So this is kind of a heat map of where people are kind of traveling around. So that has an influence. And what we've also done is kind of step back and say, if we were to look out to 2040, what kinds of locations, what sites actually do we expect there will be proposals on? And some of this, we've done this, the darkest blues are kind of live projects. It's not completely up to date. And then looking at kind of the major kind of developments around the Novus Innovation Corridor, potentially Tempe Marketplace. Then we've started to get more speculative, looking at vacant land, or where you've got maybe existing strip malls, which are significantly vacant, where you've got surface parking lots. And this is kind of taking examples from around the country where you say where you've got this level of market power and market influence and strength of demand, owners and investors start to think about those types of sites and how they may change.
I'm sorry, go back. The investors and owners look at
these types of sites, whether they are surface parking lots or vacant land. So things that are underutilized today and have the potential to carry more.
You have a parking lot that you build above it.
And a lot of the formats around sort of traditional shopping malls and strip malls are changing as well. So it's kind of this isn't a crystal ball, but it's kind of an investigation of the places that are most likely to change over the next 22 years. And so, there are those areas come together as areas which are potential to see the most change. And that change is not just about developments, but it's also about public realm, transportation, public services, amenities. The areas, I guess we're starting to say, probably need the most attention in terms of thinking about the future and setting a framework and a shape and a pattern and a design quality. And what we've finally done with this diagram is sort of bring that together to say, at this stage, very early in this process, if we were to look at where infrastructure is going, what the influence of transit is, where land is available, what are the places that actually we'd expect to see significant change, and therefore it would be really useful for the city to invest in planning for those areas so they're considered holistically.
Councilman Cuvey?
So speaking of future scenarios, and you're talking a lot about 2040, how are you integrating with the work that's being done on ASU? You've probably heard about the Sustainable Future Scenario Project that's been going on for some years, and it's led by folks in the Urban Climate Center, and they're looking at, I mean, not just climate and not just looking at drought and temperature and extremes of heat, but they're looking at trajectories of development across the valley and Tempe, and they have integrated, it's not just research, egg-headed research, shall we say, there's a lot of practitioners and urban planners and policymakers that have been involved with the scenario planning.
We haven't met with them there, and that would be really interesting to do. It's one of the fundamentals in terms of thinking about how do you grow in this kind of climate, and a climate which is potentially changing as well. I mean, there are various models of kind of what the trajectory may be over the next 50 years. So I think we'd be really interested to talk about that and what the techniques and approaches might be to integrate specifically to this climate and particular locations within the area.
About 2 years ago, the National Science Foundation founded a sustainability research network called UREX, and it's sustainable research related to extreme events, extreme weather and events. And there's a lot of work being done, not just in this area, but across the world, and ASU is kind of the headquarters of these studies, so it'd be great to connect you guys.
Yeah, that would be great. Really, So, are there any other questions on this? Because in some ways, this is a diagram we're using to say the next stage of this work would start to focus on particular locations because we expect there are going to be changes there. And this is where we would be generating scenarios, eventually the guidance around what the right approach is for the next 20 years.
Councilman Granville?
Yeah, so I was kind of saving a few of my comments for you guys to sort of look at as you move forward, but since you're asking about this specific slide, I would say one of the things that we have heard very loud and very clearly, repeatedly, is on the area west of Mill by Damage, right, the sort of Maple Ash area where Casey Moore's is, that the concern is that the area on the west side of Mill, south of University, will start to be built up, and it'll be sort of part of that tiering, which is why I assumed 20 or 30, 40 years ago it was zoned R3 instead of R16. And so now we've gone through this down zoning opportunity for people that are not interested in that and that are concerned about what that's doing. One of the strongest, most affordable, most vibrant communities I think we have is the Escalante area north of Apache. I could see us trying to repeat the actions and consequently repeating the same mistakes there, where we say, well, it's along Apache, it's along the TOD, therefore on the north side of the light rail leading into Escalante, wouldn't we want some stair stepping down? And in fact, you've listed that in yellow as an area of potential change. I think it is fair to say, at least for me, that I don't want to repeat the failures of the Maple Ash R3 zoning leading into the Escalante neighborhoods. Those are long established, single family
It's already
homes.
zoned.
Parts of it are. You're absolutely right. In our 2040 plan, parts of that got zoned as a higher density. My concern is that we're going to be reenacting the same error and eventually reenacting the same pushback as the gentrification, or at least the fears of gentrification, real or otherwise, are brought into the Escalante area exactly the way that we're in the Maple Ash area.
This kind of goes to the point where we need to be sensitive to the existing neighborhoods.
Right.
Especially when it comes to growth, and that we need to make sure that all that we take into account the stair-stepping models, even though it's a higher density, it could be, we could push that towards the frontage of
Okay.
Apache, but have it stair-step down, as you pointed out, and as it gets closer to single-family homes. And that's something that we can, even though they have a right by zoning to do certain things, but they're also going to be coming to us. That's where we look at how we can incentivize, whether it's retail or whether it's this height and density of a particular building, and how that interacts with the existing neighborhood. Councilman Navarro?
Thank you, Mayor. And I think to your point is one of the things I even got from Dr. Stapps was we have to incentivize, because if we're going to want anything that is helping with gentrification or helping with concerns that might creep into an area, then we have to have some ability to take that cost to help drive that. Because as we see right now, with development along the Apache north side and south side, it's not going to pencil out for an investor to do lower amount of units on the cost of the land and all that stuff that has to be factored in. So then what do you do, and what do we want to try to achieve? Do we keep it blank, or do we try to do something else? So the costs and the market and all those factors that I know they're going to drive in, but that's where what we have to figure out as a city, how do we, if this is our goal, how do we make this goal happen, so to speak?
Councilman Cubie?
And one more thing, as you drill down into the Escalante neighborhood and Victory Acres, there's a project called the Sustainable Neighborhoods for Wellbeing and Happiness, and it's led by the Ramsey Social Justice Foundation and Habitat for Humanity, and they're investing considerable sums in revitalizing the houses and fronts and landscaping of the neighborhood, and they're doing a lot of actually door-to-door canvassing to assess what the neighborhood wants and needs, so they're kind of a ready-made group to reach out to for input.
Before we leave this section, go on to the design part, I just want to make sure that when we looked at the numbers and the people that talk about the population and how the numbers looked, I have a question. With the student population, does it really have an effect on the overall, the vacancy? When you look at the vacancies we have, which I was kind of surprised, is that because of the students in that area?
I think that's possible. Tempe does have pretty high vacancy, and it seems like a certain percentage of your vacancy is kind of just
We're
a
saying we need more
structural.
housing units, but we have this tremendous amount of vacancy, which kind of,
Yeah, I do think looking at the vacancy, there's a number of different kinds of vacancy that you can find in census data, and I think that some of it also might be like fractional interest and units that people own that they don't intend to occupy full time. I don't think students are the entire bulk of the impact on the vacancy, but there is definitely some sort of impact. I believe that city studies have showed there's a 2 or 3% impact. So in general, I think it's a 12% vacancy for residential multifamily units. That 2 or 3% of that, it fluctuates according to whether students are in session or out of session. But so it's a big number. Only part of it is about students.
because Tempe has a higher vacancy rate just in our urban core than Phoenix or Maricopa County. It just seems interesting. We're trying to build more units, but we have a high vacancy rate. So,
Agreed.
okay.
I would also suggest part of the vacancy rate recently might also be because you've absorbed a large number of multifamily units. Every new huge building that comes online, it takes a while to fully lease up. So every large 400-unit apartment building, during the portion that it's not fully leased up, it's going to impact your vacancy. You've had such a succession of large projects come online that also will increase your vacancy, but most likely not on a long-term structural basis.
Would it be possible? I think the mayor makes a great point. I mean, so the 10 to 12% vacancy rate was a surprise to me, but I didn't get a sense from your data where that vacancy was. So for example, anecdotally, thank you. We will hear that when student housing gets built, it feels like that. And when for sale high-end housing gets built, it takes much longer time to sell and fill. Would it be possible, as part of your further research, to get us a better sense of maybe where our focus of housing should be? I think we all struggle with student housing, but it might be that's a very low occupancy rate, and that might be an indicator to us that that's in fact what we actually should be building, or encouraging the university to build more of, whichever. And that while we all really like owner-occupied, that might actually, there might not be the market yet supporting that, or so we can get a better sense of where we should be focusing.
Absolutely, it makes sense to look at that
Also,
going
just
forward.
as an add-on to that, also by pricing range. So I assume if somebody had a 2-bedroom, 1-bath for $650 a month, it wouldn't be vacant.
It would not.
But a $1,400 2-bedroom, 1-bath might have a 12 or 15% vacancy rate.
Councilman Navarro?
Thank you, Mayor. And to that point, I think it's kind of almost forecasting, when do those trends end? When does that, rental market kind of slow down? I mean, what are the projections out there, I think is what I'm trying to get to, because where's that flip to where I want to now buy? And that market starts to heat up. So it's kind of that juggling act of if we do too much, then what's the other use we're going to do with that project? So we've done that with a student housing project where we said, hey, listen, if student housing were to one day just no more market, we have ability with those units to convert them into condos because we condo platted them, or we did certain things to for the developers to incentivize that forecast in the future. And then shoot, there's one other thing I was going to add. I'll have to get back to it because I was stuck on his. So.
Before we go, one more thing. We talked the urban core and how we import jobs. And 97% of people come in from outside the core district. What suggestions would you have to reverse that? We keep saying that you're going to have feel more residential, but not everybody's going to want to live in an urban core area. So, which is, I think we see that. Even though there's housing opportunities, we have a huge vacancy rate, but some people may not want to live by student dorms. I mean, that could be the issue too. Even though some of those complexes are geared towards student population, but then when professional individuals want to come here, we can offer as much as we can. We got projects on that are trying to come through forward that are owner occupied to cater to that, but to an owner occupied to some of the jobs that are here, because I mean you can't just say we want to be more housing so people can live down here. We have housing.
What is that?
We have vacancy rate. But what suggestions would you guys have in your experience to help offset that balancing?
Yeah.
What does that 97% want
I mean,
to live downtown?
And it may be that this will balance out a little over time. So
that's
there's
the other thing.
jobs
Is it
are
by naturally will it
relatively-
balance out?
Yeah, there's jobs
So
are
if you build it, they will come.
relatively new.
Yeah.
The jobs are relatively new, and they all arrived at once. In terms of corporates relocating, and so people are coming from different locations all over the region. And what we're likely to see over time is some rebalancing as people make choices to live closer to work. But frankly, these sorts of investments in local transportation, local connections, are the sorts of things that say, yeah, I don't have to, commute an hour to get to work. I can live here and work here at the same time.
So we're doing that. I mean, we did it all at once. I mean, we're a victim of our own success, so to speak.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, I think I've heard that a lot.
Yep.
But at the same time, as we continue to plan, that's why we're looking at this as an urban core. What can you do to help us realize that? If that means, which we are, more residential units, more affordable units, and we're going to get to that part in the next part. But that's exciting.
And it's about housing that is related to the types of jobs that are in the area. And on one hand, that's the corporate jobs. There's also university jobs as well, which range from administrative to academic to service maintenance. So there's a broader question about linking the future housing market to the nature of jobs which are available in this area. I think the other thing to say is it's an open labor market, and of that 97%, some of them will be just beyond those dotted lines. So some people may be coming, from within a mile or two, and that's okay. And people, in a region like this, different centers will have different focuses. But I think there is something within the work to think about the future housing in this area should be more consciously kind of tied to the nature of the jobs that are being generated in the area, so that it is that more sustainable and kind of integrated.
Councilor Granville?
As you guys are looking at this data a little bit deeper, could you also look at maybe some peer cities to see maybe 97% is a great number, maybe, or maybe we might find that 80% is a number we should be shooting for, so that we can start to talk about some goal setting about 85% or 87, whatever, Madison, or I mean, there's lots of opportunities.
Well, actually,
for that.
they have Austin in there. We're comparative to Austin if you look at the numbers.
But we are for housing distress, but I don't know what it is for the 97% number.
For the transportation.
Right. I'd love to know. For
They don't have a
peer
streetcar either,
cities,
do they?
what,
They don't have public transit like that. They just have bus service, Austin.
I don't think they do.
It was actually really weak.
Anyway, I'd really appreciate that data, because that might give us a better sense of not just what kind of housing to build, but if we're actually doing okay or if we're kind of behind the curve.
Yeah.
And that's, to Councilman Ground's point, I think that's an excellent idea, and it's an excellent idea that we revisit this every so often, because as those trends start to change, we might have to change with what we're trying to achieve down the next 10 years or whatever, and that might look like. Because we are in a unique situation with the blank canvas that we have with the golf course and a whole bunch of other stuff. I think this is great that we're trying to forecast a little bit better and smart on what we're trying to do and achieve, but you know, one of those things is let's not go too gangbusters on one thing and then, you know, use up that land, so to speak.
Okay.
Okay. I think there's just a couple of slides. We kind of wrap up with just some of our emerging ideas around sort of what are the design considerations to kind of create a more diverse transit-oriented development model, thinking about other kinds of uses. You know, we've had great kind of success with things like libraries and ground floors, more articulated frontages. I think with taller buildings, this is all very early. You know, some of the concerns we heard are actually, they might be about bulk rather than height, and we're interested in exploring as we go along. Are there different forms, point towers that you can kind of see through, mix of densities in different areas, and kind of offsetting buildings as well, so it's not kind of a wall of height. You know, real focus on kind of what the experience is for people. Ultimately, this is about people. It's very easy for us to end up talking about buildings and light rail systems and, you know, sidewalks, but it's what's the experience of people and what do we need to think about so that people continue to find this a really attractive place to be at the ground level. Did you have a question?
Yeah, and it's intriguing because you know, I mean, we've all visited cities often where I've seen residential very close to high rise. I look at north side of Chicago where you see older neighborhoods, and yeah, and you're butt up against, but it's the delivery, it's the stuff in between, I guess, that has either made it, that's the place where I want to be, type of thing. Wrigley Field's going through an adjustment, it seems like, in that area. Last time I was there, but it works.
Yeah.
It's sought after, right? You know, so there's something to be said about that.
And then we just wanted to kind of touch on some of the things that we've heard so far. You know, there's really strong interest in how people connect to Town Lake in the future. I think there's a lot of discussion about how we connect different things that are happening. So, and what's the relationship between, say, Mill today and that kind of downtown core and potential new commercial retail jobs associated with Novus? How do we make those connections so the places are not competing, but they're actually kind of working together and thinking about balancing different types of uses? As all of you have said tonight, we've heard repeatedly, there's conversations about what's the relationship between the existing residential neighborhoods, those valued neighborhoods, strong sense of identity, strong sense of character. What's the relationship between those, and then change that will occur. There's a lot of ideas about different types of jobs. You know, been very successful in terms of bringing in kind of corporate office jobs. What else? And how do we make sure that it's kind of a rich mix of economy, role of manufacturing, fabrication, arts-based businesses, so that we get that mix in as well. There's a lot of interest in making sure that existing businesses continue to thrive. You know, the displacement question is not just a residential one, but people are talking about, well, we want to make sure some of our long-standing and favorite businesses are still here. And, you know, been here for 30 years, they should be here for another 30 years for other people to enjoy.
One of the processes, I don't know if you had a chance to look at our character areas.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, is this kind of part of that? Like, it's a continuation of this, the urban core is a mix-up of a couple of different character areas. But one of the things that was successful when we started the character areas, we identified the hubs, the points of interest, but more importantly, we asked the residents, what types of goods and services do you want? You brought that up earlier. And as we go through this process and we identify certain areas, I would be incumbent upon staff to work with you guys to find out what, with your experience, what can we do to get feedback from our residents on those particular hub areas that we identify. And maybe it's when we look at, and I'm all for re-examining the TOD overlay district and see what does it work, what does it mean for today, but also beyond, to the current users today and beyond. And then get that feedback from our residents on what types of goods and services are they may be looking for something completely different than what we may think. We don't technically reside in those areas. I think it's important to get that information from our residents. If you can And that was a huge success for us when we started going around the character areas and the meetings that I went to. Okay. Anything?
Yes, a few more things. I mean, and some of these things we've touched on already in terms of presentation, but things that people have said to us, whether it's kind of stakeholders or kind of long-term residents, the sorts of things that are coming up around the transportation overlay district. It's not all just our, kind of our own thinking here. These are things that people are saying to us that we're hearing, and of course, strong interest that. I guess a larger message that people want some certainty as well, and I think that's the purpose of this plan. Kind of people describe it as a vision, sometimes they describe it as a framework, but actually understanding how the objectives that are set in these previous plans and in character area plans actually resolve themselves on the ground. How will that resolve itself on the ground, and how can we illustrate that and demonstrate how those things get resolved on the ground in different locations across the urban core. So really being able to kind of give more certainty across the board to kind of residential community, business community, development community, institutions, government.
Anything else from the council on this? I mean, we have a lot of questions. I mean, there's about 10 questions that they were asking. You guys have any other feedback? Councilman Granville?
We touched on a lot of the stuff I was going to talk about, so I don't want to repeat any of that. Just a few things that you guys could look at moving forward. Number one is, I think we have a usual amount of sort of bike theft that happens in our downtown area. There's an unlimited number of bikes to steal, and the likelihood of getting caught is, maybe not as great as robbing a bank or something like that. Could you just look to see if there are other cities that require parking structures, or when people build that sort of stuff, to put in a designated bike area that has a camera, whether that's a caged area or a key fob area. For the residential, it's not really an issue because often they provide that for the residents that live there, or they allow them to take them up to their rooms and they've got a special designated area. But for the people who want to bike to a commercial, bike to a, it would be nice if there was something besides street parking, which is fine for like a $70 cruiser, but it's not really appropriate for a $300 or $400 road bike. And so right now people use the bike seller. You can pay like $30 a month and you can actually have space in there that's safe. But I would love to see that in parking structures as sort of, so if you could see if that's something other cities do. The other one is Councilmember Arredondo Savage and I had talked about soundproofing, because anytime we have a concert or anything at Tempe Beach Park, we often get phone calls. All of council does, or PD does. And so if there are places that in their urban core have modified their code to require a different degree of soundproofing than what would normally be under the sort of, model construction code. Third one is if anyone's ever done anything for vacant land. I mean, if you were to go to downtown Manhattan and somebody left a square parcel empty for 30 years, you'd think it was a travesty. And yet we have parcels that have been vacant for 25 years, and the carrying cost of that vacant parcel is very low because there's nothing on it. So you get the lowest property tax you want, even though you might have a entitlement to it. Because you haven't utilized that entitlement, you're actually paying a very low property tax rate. And then the third one, or the fourth one is, if anyone has ever tried to do, for that first floor commercial, if they actually had a separate category that was like a neighborhood amenity commercial. So for example, when we see commercial get built and we require it on the first floor, I'm not sure the surrounding residents that actually want to live in the downtown need another bar. And I'm not sure I'd want to tie a chiplet to that in a certain way, but I would want there to be a dry cleaner and, and all of the sort of things that a living person needs as opposed to a visiting person. And so if there's any way to create this two-level commercial system, or if anyone's done that, that would say, look, if you're going to build a bar in the first floor commercial, that's fine. But if you're going to build this other thing, a grocery store, a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, we've got special ways to incentivize that because we know that's the only way we're going to encourage long-term permanent residents. And actually, you could talk to our staff. I drafted something sort of pseudo with that for a project that never panned out. So they might have a little bit of a background in that as well. Those are my 4 things, if you could just sort of follow up.
Councilman Navarro?
Yeah, I enjoyed some of the comments. My curiosity though, on some of them though, is how can we incentivize without doing a gold wire effect to, enhance someone else's business or we're giving money to so one of my questions was, when we talk about vacant land that's privately owned, that's not city owned, where we don't have really any power to do anything, what other cities have used something to incentivize to get the type of development that they need to, that helps the neighborhood, so to speak? That would be one thing to look at. Transportation, I'm curious with what we try to project, what we are doing within our core area, is the transportation plan having ground floor in a traffic lane suitable, or, do we need to go above or below? Or because thought processes, as we are more congested, I feel people want to get to point A to point B quicker than later. And does that help with retail, like down in downtown Tempe? So if I work in somewhere off of the lake, eventually down the road, but I want to eat in the mill, well, it takes me an hour if I get in my car 20 years from now. But if I have a streetcar that's elevated, I will use that service, and so business will thrive and all that, knowledge and stuff. Is that something you guys see as crucial or not crucial, I guess? And I like the sound stuff. I would like to know, around the transportation district, though, with new builds, has there been cities that have mandated some sort of sound structure or windows with new development, and how that has gone off? And that's kind of a neat point.
More? Anybody?
Yes, so I think the Sustainability Commission, have they had a subgroup that's been working with you, or will they be? I think I heard that was happening.
Yeah, we haven't met with them yet.
That will be, because I know you've met with Dr. Braden Kay, our Sustainability Office, and I know that he's in the beginning process of planning out a climate action plan. I assume they will integrate at some point.
Yeah.
That's good to know. And we are sort of moving along with the likely adoption of the 2018 International Energy Conservation Code, which will have impacts on design and building of the downtown urban core. So keep that in mind. And I know all these discussion questions are very appropriate. I don't know if we're going to go, I guess we're not going to go through, and we've touched on some of them.
We can go through them. I mean, this is a working document. This is just the first phase of
Right.
this. I mean, we're going to continue to identify, but these are some of the questions that they're looking for from us, I mean, throughout the process. I
Right.
mean, so if you have any suggestions on some of the ideas that are there, I mean, obviously, I think one of the main factors with the Transportation Overlay District, we're looking at to re-examine that. It's been first instituted 12 years ago, so maybe some things we could look at to address the current users, the people that are here versus future development.
Yep.
And we do have that coming down the pipe for us. The scalable growth, I mean, is this the right size of an urban plan that we're looking at from the urban area? If we're good with that, I think that's one thing that we can look forward. The housing, we're going to be talking a lot. We have the next item on our agenda is about housing. What does that look like in terms of workforce affordability, and what role can we play in that, which we can to a certain extent. There's a whole host of other issues, but we're actively looking to be more involved with that. When it comes to academic development opportunities and jobs, help us understand that. I mean, I look at this is a good challenge for us because a lot of cities would love to be in this challenge. And I think you guys are the experts. What do we do in terms of sustainability, in terms of quality of life for people to be able to move in and around the urban core area? That's going to be one of the biggest challenges I believe that we're going to have, is the accessibility. It's one thing to have a project. It's great to have, they all come at one time, these jobs like you're mentioning, but then we got the pains of growing. So as we move forward, what should you guys give us some ideas of what should we be looking for, especially when it comes to transit planning? I know we're doing a study with Arizona State University with the impact of the Novus District. That's really going to change a lot of it. And what suggestions you could have for us as we look at the mobility of this urban core area to move people in and around, I think is important as well. And then you look at the industrial uses in the business district. That's on our agenda tonight as well. We have so many different areas that it's going to have an impact on the types of uses and jobs. So I'd be curious to see where we go from here. I mean, we have a vision and an idea. We have some land use plans in place It's not necessarily zoning based on our general 40 plan. It's a plan, so it's a working document. But any suggestions you would have how we would integrate into the neighborhoods with the sensitivity of the existing neighborhoods, but also making sure that we're able to scale everything appropriately from the type of businesses, the housing, the mix, and retail. I mean, retail, we're open, but I think we'll be open to any use of any type of retail. The only challenge is some of the other factors that come into this. What else?
And the idea of, complete streets. I
Mhm.
think we're all big fans of complete
Yep.
streets, and we have the nation's expert on complete streets, and David King at ASU, the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, and he uses, he works a lot in the Tempe, is using Tempe as sort of a case study.
Yeah, in the visiting workshops that you've had, can you give us a little bit of idea of what you thought the quality of the feedback was?
Your feedback?
Yeah,
The timeline, like
Excellent.
when,
no, but I mean, like the workshops that you had,
Yes,
like the one last
workshop,
night,
yeah.
and there was just some of the feedback you've received from some of the public meetings.
Yeah, so.
You had what, two?
Yeah, we had essentially an exhibition yesterday in the middle of the day, and that was an opportunity to people to come in, talk to us individually, and we had display boards and we had this presentation on a loop. So it's an opportunity for people to kind of talk to us about general questions. And then last night we had more of workshop style. So we had 10 tables. We took people through this presentation. We had 10 tables with an aerial photo of the area, of the open core area, and then we had tokens, and each token represented kind of a given scale of development. We had a packet, and we had 10 tables where people were having their own discussions about where they thought things should go. And what was interesting was it wasn't all the same ideas. I think if there's no surprise.
That is not interesting. That
Maybe
is
surprise.
par for the course.
But where there were commonalities was people are really interested in corridors. I think that's what I take away. People recognize the Rio Salado, Rural Roads, Apache, Mill, downtown, that there are places where it kind of feels appropriate that you'd want to focus because that's where the services are, that's where the access is, and kind of people recognize that that's also where the opportunities are going to be over the next 20 years. So there were lots of different patterns around that, but this idea that corridors are what kind of guides this was really important. But there were different ideas about kind of what happens in particular locations, which I think was really useful. But we also heard a lot about, it's not just about moving buildings around. We heard a lot of discussion about how this works for people on a day-to-day basis, how they get their daily needs met. As you were just saying, how they move around the area, and it's not just about the heavier infrastructure, but how they move around on feet. We heard a discussion about particular populations, the kind of people who work in the area, but who are on low or moderate incomes. So housing the workforce of the urban core and how we do that. Interesting comments about kind of particular needs populations. It's not just about the millennials, but also seniors. And this is a place that people want to come to later in their life. We also heard discussions about the needs of people who may have learning disabilities or mental health issues and how those are that community is integrated into the future as well. So it's been very rich, and we're still kind of processing kind of what we heard last night, but a very rich discussion. And I think the key takeaway was people are incredibly engaged.
It's interesting, you talk about the different demographics as it relates to age. Because you look at the median age in the urban core area, but then we also just, Arizona State University is breaking ground on a senior housing project. We do have a senior housing project on Farmer between 5th and University, which is it's kind of interesting because it's a 55 plus, and we do have some affordable housing projects within the district. We have Habitat for Humanity, we just opened Valor on 8th. So it's a very mixture of everything. And then we also look at, we have some programs, and I'm sure in that area for Section 8 as well.
To that point, Mary, there's something that came to mind. A U of A professor was talking about trends and stuff with housing and things like that. And he did mention Tempe is unique. And because there's not a lot of people that move out of Tempe, they pretty much stay in Tempe a lot.
Yeah.
So the trends, do they match up nationally, or do we have something pretty special that we need to capture too? So that might be something of a challenge for you guys, because I think we kind of do. And that's kind of unique compared to a lot of other cities in trying to manage that. And it comes down to seniors and aging out, and people want to downsize, but they don't yet want to have the big yard on some of that stuff.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic because it has some similarities with other places, and there are national macro trends around the nature of work, around the nature of retail, around the demographic structure which are playing out here. But there's also very unique circumstances given the the role of a major institution as kind of within the core of the city and how that influences, but also the rapid growth that's been experienced in the last decade or so, building off kind of the successes and investments that have been had in the past. That's not a typical story. This is probably one of the you take this urban core, it's probably by rate of growth, it's one of the fastest growing communities in the country. So, but it's happening in quite a small area, and it's all happening very quickly. And I think that's the uniqueness, is kind of capturing what's distinct about what's happening here, and then also how it relates to kind of macro trends.
What's the plan for continued engagement, public engagement, and what is the larger time frame of the study?
Yeah, so the larger, I'll go to the larger time frame first. So essentially we've got a series of phases we're working through. So the next step is to explore potential scenarios. I mean, this is kind of high level in the sense of what's the potential scale of change, what are some of the issues that we've identified, what's a potential framework where we say these are the places we want to investigate in more detail. So the next step is to look at a series of potential scenarios, which is a process which runs through April and May. Then we go to, in May and June, we start to get down to what are the schematic plans, what are design guidelines for particular areas. And as part of that, we'll be evolving the affordable housing strategy at the same time in parallel, and having that conversation between the transportation overlay district and the urban core master plan. So that's in May, June, July. And then over the summer, getting down to kind of implementation strategies. We'll focus on kind of capital improvement plan. What are the implications for zoning codes? What are the other tools that might be applied, incentive packages to achieve certain objectives? And then essentially it comes back for review and adoption processes for the elements that get formally adopted in the fall. But in terms of engagement, we have an ongoing process of meeting with local organizations, kind of going to their meetings. Not us holding a meeting, everybody coming to us, but going to those regular neighborhood meetings. We have an ongoing process of kind of sit-downs with local organizations, whether they're business organizations, residents organizations. The next kind of larger set of activities, which will be around kind of workshops, exhibitions, open houses, would be in May. And that's the point where we'll both have kind of scenarios, but ideas about how those get resolved as well. So it won't be coming with, okay, so here's a draft plan, what do you think? There's still, very open conversation across a very broad range of topics, whether it's the shape of the urban core, the affordable housing strategy, the response to transportation overlay district. But in May, there'll be kind of another round of public consultations, and then also in June as well, when we start to get to strategies around economic development, around sustainability, to your point, around transportation.
Thank you. So much.
Thank you. To be continued. Thank you. All right. Next item, are you guys here for that? Is the housing context for affordable housing impact statement update.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members. I'm Josh Romer with BAE Urban Economics. As you know, one of the major work streams in the development of the Urban Core Master Plan is the preparation of an affordable housing strategy. The presentation before you provides an overview of the activities that we've done to date, and there's two major parts to the presentation.
So first, we'll review the existing conditions for housing affordability citywide. So this is not focusing specifically on the TOD study area, but rather citywide, including current needs and projected future needs for affordable housing. We also take a look at the tools that the city currently has at its disposal to address affordability needs and other tools that we can explore through the development of the affordable housing strategy. So these are the initial findings. They're meant to be the foundation for the strategy that we develop over the course of the team's work. Then the second half of the presentation focuses in depth on one particular tool that we could take a look at in terms of dealing with affordability, and that's the Affordable Housing Impact Statement policy. And I wanted to start just with posing a few questions, because we think this is the excellent opportunity to get some more of the very quality feedback and guidance that we just experienced over the last hour. So I wanted to just address a few questions that we're hoping by the end of this, and we can return to this after the presentation, that we can walk away from to guide our work going forward. And the first question, I think we could kind of expand basically to include a discussion on what council feels like, what are the goals with regards to affordable housing in the future, and what specific tools and strategies do you think have the most value going forward in developing affordable housing strategy? The second two questions are more specifically about the Affordable Housing Impact Statement policy, basically in terms of the goals of that and what key elements should we focus on moving forward. So just taking a look at those as kind of like an overview of what we want to pull from here. We can start with a slide or two about the existing conditions for housing affordability. So as referenced in Chris's presentation, the market study findings show that household incomes in Tempe are lower than the Maricopa County average, and at the same time, housing costs are higher. So to translate the impact of those data points on Tempe households, we use a measure of housing cost burden. And this is a measure developed by the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department, and it basically looks at households' gross annual income relative to how much they spend on housing costs. Households that spend between 30 to 50% of their annual income on housing is considered an unhealthy amount. It's a moderate cost burden. Oh, thank you. Households that expend over 50% of their gross income are considered severely burdened households. And so those are considered the thresholds of cost burden. Basically, anything above 30% HUD constitutes as being relatively unhealthy in terms of overall housing finances. Tempe's share of housing cost burden is 36.8% overall. So 36.8% of all households are cost burdened to some degree. This is higher than the Maricopa County, and the national averages which are both around 33 or something. So there's a degree of more intense cost burden in the city of Tempe.
Just ask one question about that. So one of the wonderful things about Tempe is we have many residents who literally watch their house get built, right? They watched it get built in the 60s, and that was sort of the nature of the build out of Tempe and the sort of boom of Phoenix via air conditioning.
Yeah.
So you can go back one slide. Would it be possible, assuming you're coming back with more information, to get those ownered households and get a separate number of the burden of people who actually even have a payment? Because here's my guess, of that 28.9% that are burdened, I'm going to bet that once you start looking at the number that actually even have a payment at all, I'm going to bet that number is significantly higher. Because my guess is we have I have no idea, but my guess is we have a disproportionate number of people who own their house outright and have no burden compared to Chandler or Gilbert or Glendale, where they tend to have a newer housing stock.
Yeah.
And so consequently, practically everyone still is in their 30-year mortgage. Thank you.
We can definitely look at that.
I would appreciate that.
Great, thank you. So translating that percentage in terms of the actual number of households we're talking about, there are around 25,600 cost-burdened households. The majority of these are renters. 73% of the cost-burdened households are renters. The most impacted folks are people that are extremely low and very low-income households. The table on the right-hand side basically looks at the rate of cost burden according to the percentage of households' area median income. So for extremely low-income households that make less than 30% of the area's median income, 94% of them are cost burdened, which makes sense in many ways. And talking about beyond moderate cost burden, but severe cost burden, 56% of extremely low-income households experience severe cost burden, which is considered substantially unhealthy in terms of family well-being and outcomes. So that's kind of, the sort of.
Let me ask you this,
existing
is there a
things.
relationship to the 56% of very low and 70% of extremely low income rental house live in this community because of the transportation and the truly multimodal, and it's at the center of the valley? Because if you look at Tempe in terms of, we have a multimodal transportation system. We're the only city surrounded by 5 freeways. And we're technically at the center. Now, you may see it be more least expensive for individuals to live somewhere further out in a different city, but they chose to live here because they have the attractiveness of transportation options for individuals to go to work or get to and from their place.
Yeah,
Is
there's
there
a
any
trade-off.
relation to that?
Well, there definitely is a trade-off, and I think there's current research that we have taken a look at for this, but there is definitely a trade-off where you could find cheaper housing in Gilbert, and so there is a case to be made that it makes more sense to have low-income folks live in Tempe because they do have access to more services and more transportation than they would otherwise. Yeah. So in terms of looking at the future growth that we've talked about happening through 2040, so all the new incomes all of the new households that are expected to accrue to Tempe over the next 22 years are also expected to come in a variety of income levels. So looking at the number of units that would be needed to address housing affordability across the new households, we see there's over 21,000 households that will be needed. Around 50% of them are moderate income households that would be market rate, but a large proportion, 42%, would be lower income households. These are households that will earn incomes that will require them, that will challenge them in finding affordable housing.
Councilman Navarro?
Yeah, what is this, are students in this mix, ASU students, they're not in this mix, or are they in this number?
Most are, yes. So it gets very challenging. So census data about students is notoriously limited, so it's really difficult to make direct numerical comparisons to the degree that we would like to. So the cost burden looks at all households, and so it looks at all households.
Including dormitories?
It does not, but it is, yeah, so there's a chunk of
10,000 people off
yeah,
the top.
there's a portion of the student population that's not counted in the housing cost burden calculation because dorms and fraternities don't count as households.
What student housing, does that count as?
Yeah,
Off
off campus,
privately owned.
Off-campus student housing.
Yes.
Right.
which is the majority of
Right.
this.
But the 10,000 students who live in the residence halls don't count.
Yeah, so they're pulled out of the CHAZ equation. So the impact of students on your cost burden is blunted to some degree. So as I mentioned, 42% of the households expected to accrue to Tempe over the next 22 years are lower than 80% AMI.
Can I ask one question just about Joel's? To his point, one of the things that we don't know, I assume, is, so I might be a student living in off-campus private student housing. My income is effectively zero or not much, 20 hours a week that I work at a Subway shop. And so that person would show up as extremely low income, but there's no way we would know or track if their parents were sending them $1,000 a month to help out. Okay.
That's accurate.
That's why.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the challenge. So based on those existing needs and the projected future needs for affordability, we took a look at what are the tools that Tempe currently has at its disposal to kind of address the situation and improve it in the future. So the headlines of these reviews, and this is with with staff and with community stakeholders and affordable housing stakeholders, we find that Tempe does have a certain amount of federal resources that are available at your disposal, and you guys effectively use them to address some of your housing needs. Section 8 vouchers, home funds, and CDPG funds. The level of effort, I would say, for these is very high. This is challenging work to do, so your city staff can be commended for working with this. And the amount of resources is low, so ultimately the number of units you're able to generate every year doesn't come anywhere near to addressing the kind of numbers that we're talking about in terms of the need. And in the future, we should not expect that the federal resources are going to increase to any degree. I think it is safe to say. Beyond that, the city has not dedicated any annual sources of income for affordable housing. In terms of the community of affordable housing developers, there's a small community valley-wide that have very effective, that are very effective and have good experience. They're very eager and willing to work in Tempe, but they frankly find it a little challenging because the cost of land is so high, it makes it difficult to make any traditional subsidized project pencil out. So you have definitely willing participants, they find it difficult. And as it has came out in earlier discussion, it's unfortunate because for a lot of reasons, Tempe is a really great place for affordable housing because you have services and transportation and jobs nearby for households that might not be able to, to drive out from the suburbs.
Councilmember Cuban?
And I think you mentioned in your detailed memo, though, and there's also the state preemption activities which have taken away tools like inclusionary zoning and then the issue that you were working on, Councilmember Granville, to require developers to build in affordability if they took away affordability. So that's a big part of.
Not to mention.
Absolutely, the legislative context is one of the bigger issues we're dealing with. I agree.
Not to mention Prop 207 either.
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, and so when we start to talk about options for what we can explore looking forward, we are hemmed in by those. We need to be creative in terms of how do we maneuver around those existing sort of legislative boundaries.
But I mean, I'm not opposed, and I think this council's not, just knowing my colleagues, that we'd be looking at more resources that we would like to put into affordable housing. But with that being said, though, we've also given direction to start our own community land trust. And at some point, Chad, and if we can get an update on that with the community land trust, where that's heading. But it's interesting to know, when we look at affordable, what is the biggest question we've grappled with years? We always talk about affordable housing. Well, define affordable housing. Then we talk about workforce housing. Well, what's the definition of a workforce housing? So if you can help us identify some of those areas, I think that'd be really helpful for us, because what we may think is affordable is not what we look at as affordable housing, or what, that's why it'd be good to hear from all of you on that issue.
Absolutely, understood. And so in terms of...
Just to respond to that, one of the pieces that we're finding is, in our discussions, we have done some definitions in regards to the area median income, and looking at like 0 to 80% area median income being defined as affordable housing for Tempe, which is consistent with HUD.
Yeah, we've had that, but
Yeah,
we need to put that into our plan.
Yes, absolutely, and that's what we're doing. Thank you for the clarity.
So just kind of, the last headline in terms of the initial assessment of the affordable housing tools was kind of expressed by one of the stakeholders that we talked with, is that the toolbox is not full. So, Councilmember, you're right, there are a lot of limitations on there, but there still are other tools and policies and programs that could be potentially implemented. So, fortunately now we have the opportunity to explore those through the work that we're doing with the city now.
That'd be good.
Yeah. So the next slide provides a number of different suggestions that we think we could potentially look at working with staff and understanding the city's goals in terms of different ways. And I will say, just in general, of housing affordability in a growing city like Tempe, it's an ongoing issue, and it can be sometimes intractable. There's not a silver bullet policy that there's not one thing that you can do that solves everything. You have to solve it from 12 different directions at once, and each of them, kind of add to, the variety of housing to serve all kinds of households. So it may be that you decide that we should go in all these directions at once, and I think that's actually an appropriate response, or a potentially appropriate response. But so just to briefly discuss what some of these planks could be of an affordable housing policy. I mean, the first step, and was just referred to in the last discussion, is to determine what are the reasonable goals for what Tempe can and wants to do to improve housing affordability, whether it's workforce housing, whether it's extremely low housing, or something in between. We will talk more specifically about affordable housing impact statements in a second.
Yes, Councilman Granville?
So for me, this was actually the biggest takeaway from this entire presentation. The data we've seen in 2 other presentations over the last 3 years. The takeaway for me, and Andrew, I would ask you on this one, if we wanted to set a goal, right? Like, we've got a whole series of goals for whether it's renewable energy or tree canopies or code enforcement. My takeaway from this is we need to have a annual production goal or ratio that we think that of that 21,000 housing units that we know we're short, we think we should be reaching this goal based on some national average, best practice, community, whatever. Something that smart people have figured out. what would be our next step if we wanted to do that? If we wanted to either incorporate it into the study or task Rosa to go and work with the work group people. I'm open to all suggestions, but I don't want this presentation to come and go without us having a serious conversation about goal setting so that we can start to talk about, every 5 years or 3 years, are we getting closer to our goal or are we getting farther away from our goal?
To add
Councilman
on,
Navarro?
just to boot just the realistic data, the realistic drive that we can do, so students can't be in the factor, I guess.
Right, absolutely. So the goal would have to be, to add a certain number of units or to have a certain percentage or to make it so that that previous slide of distressed housing is a certain percentage after we take into account students. I think there's lots of smart people that can come up with a better goal than I could come up with, but I don't even know what we do from here to get to that goal, as opposed to just sort of having some data and being like, yeah, we should try harder.
They're going to help us.
Yeah. And I would suggest that as attractive as it would be to have a goal, a numerical goal that Tempe felt like if you hit that 20,000 unit mark, that the job would be done. It has to be much more complicated than that, unfortunately, because market changes. It's going to be different every year.
I think one thing though, I think the most difficult thing is to set a goal, right? The most difficult thing is to set a goal that is both understandable, movable, definable, dollar mountable to, and so there is something in some way, in some format that we can measure and check in on and try to move. I don't know what that is, but I would really like it if we had something so we could say, like, we're trying, and we know that. I always go back to Don's example, he's not even here anymore, of the water conservation. Is there's 10 things to do for water conservation, but if your goal is water conservation, then you really need to look at the per dollar spent per gallon saved ratio. And if there's anything I've learned in this that I'll take away at the end of 8 years, is that having somebody go door to door and educate people doesn't sound exciting, but it turns out it's the most cost-effective dollar to gallon ratio that we do, even though it's not, sprinkler heads or whatever, low turf, whatever. And so I just need to know I need to know a goal so that I can know per dollar spent, what's the best way to move the needle on that goal.
Councilmember Granville, we have been having conversations with Rosa and her group about creating a performance measure as part of the strategic management process. We placed a kind of a very generic point there at the moment with an understanding that we're going
to placeholder there right now, right?
We're going to utilize this group to help us provide those options. And so we have been debating, we have come up with initial conversations of coming up with numbers, which is a percentage of housing that would be an affordable housing or workforce or market rate. And then from that research, we've also
whether it's rental or owner occupied or whatever
that may be, absolutely. And in addition to that, we also have the conversations, is that the best way to go? And this group is helping us define whether that actually is the best approach, or is there a different index that makes more sense that we can present at a later time to help with.
So is it a reasonable expectation that in the next 6 months there'll be something that we can sort of look at and discuss, or is that not a reasonable expectation yet?
I believe with the way the timeline that this project is working, it was August, September-ish is when the intention to have these draft documents put together with recommendations in them.
Okay.
So I believe that would be an appropriate timeline.
I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
So walking through some of these, another opportunity for us to look into is an inclusionary policy for citywide land. So we could explore how Tempe can prioritize the inclusion of affordable units when city-owned land is conveyed for development. I think we could potentially look at taking a similar approach for when other incentives are applied through a PAD or through a GIPLET, that if the city had a blanket policy that no matter what, if we're providing some sort of development benefit, that we are going to have an ask that addresses affordability. So it's a potential plank to look at. Also working within the bounds of Arizona's strong laws for private property protection, it could make sense to explore a voluntary density bonus policy where developers are allowed to build some amount of more units and a portion of them be affordable.
Doesn't really work because all we do are PADs. So everything's
All through
already
PADs.
negotiated. So You can't negotiate and then negotiate. I mean, maybe it could be done, but it's a tough
It could
thing.
be done as, I think,
City
if we get on working with potential developers in the future, when they start coming down the pipeline, at least we can ask them, because they're gonna be looking for something.
But the idea of a density bonus means they get to 4 votes and then somebody says, well, but remember I can do 20% more. It's tough to do it when you don't do a code base, when everything's a one-off. Maybe it's possible.
We also highlight the benefits of an affordable housing trust fund. So it will be an annual amount of funds from, whether it's from the general fund or whether it's from ground lease proceeds when land is conveyed for development. We think it makes a lot of sense. It helps develop staff capacity. It provides some continuity with affordable housing providers that are looking to potentially work with the city. And it can also make tax credit projects more competitive on a statewide basis. And kind of moving beyond the ideas of subsidizing affordable units, we also recommend looking at ways to facilitate the development of naturally affordable units. And a lot of this dovetails into the missing middle conversation we had in the previous conversation. Facilitating the development of unit types that are, bungalow courts or townhomes. They use land more efficiently and are therefore naturally affordable. That doesn't necessarily require government subsidy. So we look forward to working with the design elements of the team to figure out how missing middle can kind of help provide units that aren't necessarily subsidized.
These are some good recommendations, but as we continue to explore, it's also important to put a number next to it in terms of the cost, because all these are going to have some form of cost associated with it, and that's ultimately going to affect how we budget. Because, I mean, if we have a priority to look at some of these, I mean, if we're looking at additional funding for the Housing Trust Fund, if you're looking at, we have the reviving that home improvement program that we have, there's a cost with that. Any other, I mean, we could go look for additional resources. That's something we can look at. Any of the other opportunities in there, if there's a dollar amount, that'd be good, Paul, that as we go and plan and budget for the future years, because this is coming back, be for the next budget cycle, this is important for us to have, if we include this, we may determine what decision we're going to make during our budget process over here. So a lot of that commingles.
I'm sorry.
I'll just add one thing to that. Back before I was on council in 09 or 10, I got myself stuck on the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And we met for a while. It's a citizen commission. And we met for a while, and eventually we all sort of packed up and went home because we had no money. And so there was just no reason to meet. I don't even know if the committee even exists anymore. And so one of the things that would be helpful, to go to the mayor's point, is if you could come to us with some sort of recommendation on a revenue stream. Now, whether that's to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or whether that's to the new group that's being created, it doesn't matter to me. Whatever you think is the best use. I know Robin and I talked during our budgeting process about maybe having 10% of the GIPLET revenue stream earmarked specifically for that group. I don't know what'll come back with that or not, but I would look to you all to give us some sort of guidance, not just on what we should be doing, but what other cities are doing, so that we're sort of in alignment with, or given the option to do more or less or whatever. But I just don't really have a sense right now of what that stream should be. And if I'm sure we're not meeting it, because right now we're putting in 0.
On the understanding that it's always challenging to put in general funds.
For sure.
I definitely have seen in other cities where properties that are conveyed for development, they're done through, rather than an outright sale, but through ground lease. And so proceeds are distributed over a 99-year time period, or whatever the period of the ground lease is. So that acts as an annual contribution to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And that's a way that less painful on an annual budgetary basis.
And then my last question is, one of the things that we'll do sometimes is we'll sell land, incur that revenue, and then use part of that revenue to help out with workforce housing or projects or whatever. And one of the things that you said here is, which didn't even occur to me, was that the idea of the problem of doing maybe not affordable housing, but workforce housing is land costs. And I'd be curious, as you guys research this, to get your opinion. Is it better for us to sell land, take that revenue stream, and then use that revenue stream to help with workforce housing? Or is it better for us to hold that land and force workforce housing onto that land to offset?
Our land.
Yeah, our land, right, our land, right. Right,
We don't have
and that's
much.
an example. For example, Councilmember Navarro brought this up at where Apache turns onto Dorsey, and it's a genius idea that we're work with the local developer and add our land, and then you get this great project that they could never have afforded to do on their own. But we could have done it the other way, which is what we traditionally have done, is we've sold that land, brought in that revenue, and then used that revenue for workforce housing. And so whichever is the preferred method, I think it'd be interesting to know, because that might determine what we do, for example, with the project that we just got, the squatters land project. If that's something that we want to sell and then use, or if we want to simply build workforce housing on that location.
Well,
Part of what I'd like to add to this conversation with what's already been discussed is that we have been able to move forward with some of the strategies that we brought forward a few weeks ago. Our housing and revitalization manager, Levon Lamy, working with city staff, created the affiliate nonprofit. And with that, we have been able to purchase our first unit with that affiliate. We have 2 more on the way. What that means is that we, as the Housing Authority and Housing Revitalization, are able now to purchase units in order to control their affordability through perpetuity. And so while that is a small component of what's being discussed tonight, what happens with that in regards to the funding source is that the income coming from those units will go back into the program and they will compound upon themselves so we can purchase more units. So as with your ask, yes, we will come back with the budgetary components of what that would
it'd
look
be helpful,
like.
because we're going to need that as we
Absolutely.
make decisions in the future.
And in addition, we are already moving forward in making those plans happen.
And Mayor, to that point, there are great numbers to bring back, because that might be something worthwhile to say the council could throw additional money towards if it compounds over, years and years to get even bigger and bigger. Does that investment help, and what's the payoff on that investment? So I'd like to see those numbers.
We will include that.
So moving on to the next slide, the second part of this presentation focuses on one of the specific tools that I understand the city and staff are very interested in. Those are affordable housing impact statements. Impact statements policies are part of a response that several cities across the country have adopted to concerns that housing costs, as they are in Tempe, are rising faster than incomes are. So the cities that have adopted housing impact statement policies have cost burden rates also that are higher than the national average. Cities that adopt impact statement policies are basically looking for a few specific benefits. They're looking to elevate the visibility of affordable housing, basically make it a priority, make it clear that we're always going to be looking at this when we make future city decisions. It's also true that the data that comes to affordable impact statements can help the city track its progress towards its affordability goals. The concerns that cities look at when they're considering the adoption of an impact statement policy is whether this will be an administrative burden on city staff. There's also the question about whether it presents a burden on developers or applicants. Those concerns highlight the need to design a policy that is as low impact as possible and is relatively simple.
Just curious, if we adopted a housing impact statement, how would this really affect some of the current developers, even the smaller developers that we have now?
Ideally, the impact statement policy would be designed so that when you apply for your entitlements, you provide the necessary information for staff to basically do its assessment.
Okay.
And that should be it. Ideally, it's not that much more information than they already submit. I think that the only additional information would be about what are the proposed rent levels for units that are proposed in the property, and if they are removing any units from the existing improvements, what AMI levels are those? But if those are integrated into the application process, ideally this should be a relatively streamlined policy.
Yeah.
And so just a few of the key elements of what impact statements have looked like across the country. There are only 5 impact statement policies that have been adopted across the country, so there's a relatively finite number of examples that we're looking at. Basically, impact statements can apply to policies. These are like long-range planning, funding, changes in fees or building codes that might make it more or less expensive to build housing. Or you can look at projects, specific development projects. This is kind of like the first thing people think of when they think of impact statement policies. Impact statement policies can look at supply. So these are changes of the number of units that are located on site and what AMI they're at. Some impact statement policies also look at demand, and this is mostly for commercial properties So looking at whether the construction of a new office building or a new grocery store, whether that increases the demand for workforce housing because some of the employees that work in that facility will need affordable units. This is generally more appropriate for cities that have impact statement or impact fees for affordable housing and might not be appropriate in this context, right?
You got stripped for impact fees.
Exactly.
From our friends down at the legislature.
Your friends. Your old friends.
Your old friends.
Hey, they're not my friends. Old colleagues.
I left for a reason.
So impact statements can also look at impacts in qualitative ways or quantitative ways based on the information that's available to them. For the most part, impact statements are meant to be informational. They're for the purposes of allowing decision makers to make quality decisions. They're not presented as hurdles. There's only one example across the country where there's actually a hurdle provision whereby the city manager needs to waive a policy or a project if it does have a negative impact on affordability. That's the anomaly, not the rule.
We do have some impact fees, though. Could we use those? How could we use, if you could be creative, how we use those?
It's pretty locked in by the legislature.
That's what I thought.
The areas that you.
I mean, we have it, but
Yeah.
what I mean by we're restricted in how we can use them.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
We're
Impact fees.
impact fees.
Oh, yeah.
We have it, but we're restricted in how we can use them.
And how they can be assessed, I presume. Yeah. So affordable housing is not an impact that has any legal basis in the state of Arizona. Yeah, understood. And I wanted to mention, and this adds to the discussion we had previously about what's required for an impact statement policy from the developer perspective. So no city has a user, there's no cost, there's no application fee applied because of an impact statement policy. You do need to look at some staff costs to design the program and adopt the program and implement the program.
So again, the potential, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
The concern of it being a burden on developers, or concern it could lead to more onerous requirements. I mean, that hasn't been discovered in the case studies you looked at.
Regarding that, so I guess I'll phrase it this way. I think that especially in cities where there are impact fees for affordable housing or nexus study fees, I think that some developers would rather not have a quantitative assessment of exactly what the impacts of their development is on affordable housing because it might lead to other fees. So whereas an impact statement policy itself doesn't impose any fees, it provides information that might prompt a legislative body to impose fees. So I think in some jurisdictions where there's been some developer uncomfort with the idea of an affordable housing impact statement, it's for that purpose, for that reason. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily the issue in Tempe's context because you're very constrained in terms of applying additional fees, regardless of how much information you have in front of you. So in assessing the impact statements that we've looked at across the country, it's challenging because there are no published studies or measures of outcomes. And the few impact statement studies, there's only 2 that have been adopted previous to 18 months ago. So they're mostly very new. And the 2 that have the longest track record are very different. They're almost diametrically opposite in terms of impact statement policies. So it's hard to make a blanket statement in terms of what outcomes are. Tempe, looking at an impact statement policy, the data shows that affordability is an issue here. As we've discussed earlier, 37% of households are cost burden. That's above the county average, it's above the regional average, and it's above the national average. But the local context is important. Ultimately, a policy decision has to weigh the costs and benefits and the city's values and the city's goals. In our initial assessment, we feel that the benefits are potentially substantial and are the basis of building a larger affordable housing strategy. It's an important first step, we think, and we think that the costs are manageable. So ultimately, we recommend that that affordable housing impact statement policy be wrapped into and considered as part of the larger affordable housing strategy. It's an important informational step. It's the first step, and with relatively low barriers to entry.
No, I do agree with that. I mean, I do agree that the impact statement does, it will have, it needs to be part of a larger comprehensive affordable housing strategy. I think if that helps us get there, that's great. I think it's important. One of the things I do want to keep in mind, though, knowing our boundaries and our limits legally, that as we look at this, it's going to be, because people are going to be watching, it's important that we keep in mind that what we are legally bound by impact statements such as this. I think as we move forward, we have Prop 207, we have some of the other issues that you brought up earlier that we talked about, what we can and can't do regarding impact fees and how we do that. So, I mean, I clearly see the benefits as you guys point out, and I think we should look at this. And if this really helps us to an overall affordable housing strategy, that's exactly what one of the vision and the goals and that we look at as a council.
Understood. So given the recommendation that we think that it makes sense in this context, the goal for working forward on this would be to provide quality information to city decision makers about the impacts of policies and projects. We would work with staff, and I think it would make sense to do some outreach to developers and owners to identify potential concerns that can be anticipated, with the objective of developing a streamlined process that gives you the quality information that you need when making decisions. And ideally, it would be accompanied by other policies as part of the affordable housing strategy that actually generate units.
Lauren?
So may I suggest and get the consensus of the council on this, that if we're going to identify and reach out to developers and owners to identify concerns, that we also reach out to, say, Newtown or Habitat or project partners that we've had to build affordable housing and see what their sense is as well?
And that's part of the question I was trying to get for earlier. It's like if we have a housing impact statement, what does that mean to some of like the smaller developers that we already are working with, or even like a Habitat, like a Newtown? What would this impact have on them? Because that's basically what I was trying to ask that question. I didn't phrase it properly, but that's what I was looking at.
Thank you. So in response, we have had a pretty initial outreach campaign and spoken with a lot of the affordable housing developers that you've mentioned actually, and with Newtown, and brought up the idea, and there's basically been general support at this point. And so I was proposing to extend that to more market rate for-profit developers, just to kind of get the balance of it. But I definitely agree with the sentiment that we need to have a good understanding of what the development community feels.
Councilor Granville?
Yeah, I think this is a great idea. I know Councilmember Cubey's been talking about this for a while, so I appreciate it coming to fruition. In my mind, I imagine that there was some sort of threshold square footage or number of units. So I wouldn't expect someone building a house or maybe even a fourplex to have to do this. That seems like a little bit of a burden. But certainly at a certain point, you got to do this. And I can give you an example with, and I agree with the mayor, like, I don't think this is the only decision that we do. And once we get the information, you know, we're very limited on how we can create policies around it. But I'll give you an example with this. I would have loved this. About 6 months ago, we had a builder come in who was bringing a lot of great jobs, right? It was, I don't know, $70,000 a year jobs, and there were going to be 700, 800 of them, 1,000 of them. And we were providing a tax incentive and, you know, trying to get them in, and it was a great project. And I initially voted no, blindly, to be fair, because and I changed my vote because of it, because I realized how blindly I was voting. Because I thought to myself, okay, 1,000 people making 80,000, I'm just making up the numbers and I don't remember them that well, but 1,000 people making 80, it was I think one of the banks.
Yeah.
1,000 people making $80,000 a year, what effect does that, with no associated housing to it, right? It's just the building and the workers. And now I know that only 3% of them are going to live in Tempe, that 97% of them might drive to Tempe. But at the very least, then I could say, okay, well, that's 30 people that are going to bring, you know, homes or whatever. And I start to calculate those numbers in my head and think, what would the impact on housing be when this is built out? And so all I could do at that meeting was just not even really thumbnail it, because I didn't even have a framework to thumbnail it. But for those kind of projects, I would love to know, you know, what is the burden we're putting on our housing based on the percentage of people that are going to continue to live here. And then, of course, the reverse being is when you tear down 1960s, you know, apartments to put up a high-rise, there's actually both a plus and a minus that you've done there, because it's a two-step equation. But in both of those cases, I don't know if that would be the deciding factor, but it would certainly be a factor in me voting yes or no, or wanting to offer a tax incentive or not.
Let me answer.
Go ahead.
I was just going to suggest, so the first analysis that you did in your head the first time you heard the proposal was basically an analysis of a demand impact.
Right.
And I'll say those are generally, those are very challenging, and often in other jurisdictions, staff will rely on consultant help to do demand analysis or something like that for an office building with 1,000 folks in it that make $80,000 a year. It's more challenging to do that than a supply analysis, but that's an example of what, of a demand analysis, your example.
Councilman Navarro?
Yeah, and to that point, I imagine there's challenges with that because I don't know the wants and needs of each individual and where they want to live and how they want to live and what type of units they want to live in. You know, all these factors, you know, and the limit amount of space that we have in Tempe and the limit amount of housing, especially just single, traditional housing versus condo or even high-rise type of living, you know, maybe there's a market for about 50 of them wanting to live in a condo. So I think a lot of those factors have to be kicked into that to really figure out where we're going to be at. It looks.
Points well taken.
Councilman Cubey?
So to Councilmember Granville's point, I'm not sure that affordable housing impact statements relate to developments that are not housing. I thought, don't they relate more to housing developments?
Supply demand.
Or can they be
They certainly
expanded,
can. I
extrapolated?
mean, I think it's more common in cities that have affordable housing impact fees that they will assess the impact of commercial development. If a new Walmart opens up, you look at the workforce, the number of employees, the expected wages for those employees, and you can do an analysis of what the expected impact on the affordable housing stock would be. I
That's
think
if you
it's
have a
less
fee
relevant.
in
I think it's less
assessment.
relevant, perhaps in Tempe, where you couldn't assess a fee on the basis of that impact.
Okay.
California loves it.
Can I just add something?
Yes, Councilman
So I think, I agree that we couldn't insert a fee, but we might withhold an incentive. And that's the part, in the example I gave you, there was actually a GIPLET that we were offering. And so we might say, look, here is the 8-year GIPLET that we were going to give you. We know that you've created this demand, and you get 6 years unless you can figure out something with this demand problem, and then we'll give you the 8 years. So I think there's a difference between not being able to create a fee versus withholding a gift. Gift is not the right word because that's a term of art, but you know what I mean, an incentive.
So just in terms of added information on the basis of your interest in that sort of analysis. So generally, we've been talking about how staff costs are relatively low. So for a demand analysis in that sort of a situation, that tends to have more of an additional cost, either for training staff or hiring a consultant to do that. So that's a kind of a more complex analysis.
Yeah, there's other factors involved too. In terms of the benefits of individuals coming here that spend money in your community that help with the sales tax, and we're a sales tax driven economy. So there's a whole nother flip side of that needs to be measured. Okay.
So that concludes the analysis and recommendations for the Affordable Housing Impact Statement Policy. So we basically, we've returned to the 3 questions we initially had that we posed at the beginning, just to kind of have the opportunity for additional feedback and questions from council to inform the future work we do on the affordable housing strategy.
What information do we not have that we would gain from affordable housing impact statement?
Well, I don't think you please, I may be wrong, but I don't believe you necessarily know for any current project that comes across the transom what is the level of affordability and whether there are any displaced units and what the level of affordability of those units were.
Right.
I don't believe that that's currently would be part of the information that's at your disposal.
That's correct.
Okay. So that's.
It's also a sense, it's a tool, it's sort of an observational tool. It's not going to create affordable housing, but it kind of forces the council to tune in and make that part of the decision making process.
I'm totally supportive. I'm just asking the question. Maybe we missed something. Anybody else have anything? So I think it's important that we're looking at an affordable housing impact statement policy, but how that looks, we look as we plan through this and we reach our stakeholders and individuals that we talk to. I think it'd be important to get that information before we move forward with that. Is everybody in consensus with that?
I just want a personal note of thanks to all of you, of course, but to Ryan Levesque for advancing this affordable housing impact statement sort of a little bit ahead of some of the other issues, because it was a tool that seemed to me that could be established earlier and be useful to us, as soon as possible. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you.
It was good stuff.
Thank you. That's great stuff.
It is.
Great.
All right. Next item is the character area analysis into developing planning. Ryan and Chad. Go ahead.
Mayor, Council, back to here tonight, talk about the process and how we've adopted our character area plans and how we basically utilize it for the development plan review process. So to date, we have adopted 4 character area plans out of the total of 8. We're currently working on the 5th character area plan, which includes the downtown, northwest neighborhoods, and Town Lake area. But just a little quick background information on what is a character area plan. So character plan is a way to basically convey the vision, goals of an area to create basically positive change. Each area plan is firmly rooted on placemaking principles and design guidelines. Some other ways that character area plans can be utilized is basically as an economic development tool to identify specific area needs, identify some businesses that basically those community members want to see attracted into those areas, and to be able to lure those businesses in there and identify what types of amenities the neighbors would like to see. It could wide range of either bike paths, planning public parks, designing streetscapes, as well as part of the budgetary process for those efforts. Now, what the character plan is not is basically it does not come with any specific funding for those projects that are maybe identified in the plan. Character plans cannot supersede our higher level policies and legal requirements like the general plan, the zoning and development code, and other existing state and city laws. But what the character plans do is identify guidelines and use words like support and encourage. So a little bit more about the development planning process. Specifically, we use the character area plans when we're reviewing developments consisting of either commercial, industrial, residential, civic development for the following types of requests: general plan amendments, zoning map amendments, planned area development overlays, and development plan reviews, which are basically site plan, design, landscaping. At the first onset of seeing a request, we provide the applicant with a list and a reference to those specific adopted character area plans, give the applicant the opportunity to review it, respond to it, and see how their plan implements or does not implement certain objectives within the character area plan. And then staff works with the developer applicant to see how those implementation tools, how those placemaking design elements can be introduced into their project. When the application is then prepared and presented to boards, commissions, and city councils, staff will then present basically an outline in the staff report. In the page of the memo, we presented an example that basically identifies in the project analysis what character area plan this site is located in and what elements of either the plan either meets or does not meet those certain objectives. And we'll get into specific elements such as landscape treatments, shade, streetscapes, and other elevations of pedestrian scale and amenities. So if I'll have any questions from the council, we can certainly get into other specifics that you have regarding the use of the character area plans.
That's good. I think as I mentioned earlier, and looking at the urban core, how important the character area plans, it was a prelude to what we're talking about. And we're getting the feedback from our residents, and we are looking at as design principles as we move forward with certain areas of this throughout the city, not just in the urban core. And I think this has been very helpful. The meetings I've been to that I've attended with the residents has been very positive. At the very beginning, I think, Ryan, if you remember, some of these individuals were more hesitant, but now they like, oh, this is fantastic. This is great. This is good buy-in that we're getting with our residents and reaching out to them. It just helps with the overall planning. Councilman Granville.
Yeah, I really liked the presentation. I know I talked before about how are these be incorporated into our packet when we do a project or we vote on something. I think one of the things that we talked about at that time is to be maybe not a recommendation, but this is some like a couple of tiers of language. This is generally in conformance with the character area plan. This is minimally in performance with the character area plan. Whatever sort of terminology is used. I didn't really see that in this, but for me, we've spent, and I think I asked for this, I don't know, a month ago, about how much money we'd spent on these character area plans, and it's going to be in the millions of dollars by the time we're done. It's already quite a bit. For that kind of money, I want it to be useful to developers, but I also want it to be informative to me when I vote, that you're not just telling me, yes, there is a character area plan, and yes, we showed it to the developer, and yes, we advised them not to move forward based on what the character area plan is, but I want you to then have advised me that, by the way, as we told them at the start, this is probably not in conformance with the character area plan. Because I don't think telling them if it is or isn't is necessarily a particularly scary thing unless they know that I know what you told them, if that makes sense. So I would look for a couple of tiers of hedged language as part of each thing we vote on, so I would know how it fits in.
Certainly, we have it in the specific sections, but if we could highlight it more in certain areas to
Put
bring
it
it a
bold,
little
whatever.
more
Put it in,
prominence.
dummy council member speak so that I don't miss it.
Certainly.
Thank you.
And just so you know, when we say it costs, hundreds and thousands of dollars, that really includes our staff that we're doing it in-house, yeah,
That's staff time.
to the benefit of something that we asked for.
Yes.
My name was, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next, innovation hubs and proposed Smith Industrial Innovation Hub project. This is exciting. Donna? This is a little area that's part of the urban core area, so this is good.
My
Right,
favorite pizza
well
place is.
intended. Good evening, Mayor and Council members. Donna Kennedy, Economic Development Director. Alongside of me, I have presenting tonight, we have Hunter Hansen he's our Community Development, how did the title go now? Project Management Coordinator. And we have Elisa Lyons from our Discovery Triangle Corporation. Discovery Triangle Corporation helps communities along the light rail to further their goals for development and outreach for the business community. So we're very excited to have her on the team. We're here tonight because Innovation Tempe, our hubs, this has been part of the Economic Development Strategic Plan. Our city manager has approved us to move forward to come up with concepts to present to you to advance innovation hubs. Here tonight, we want to get the innovation hubs concept, but also a pilot project to approval to move forward. We've been working with various city departments. We've had various stakeholders presentations, businesses. We've had the endorsement of Greater Phoenix Economic Council saying that this was the best plan that they've seen from their membership community. So we'd like to have this go forward and move forward with our urban core, downtown core master plan. We think that it fits nicely into it. We think the guidelines that'll come out of it, these innovation hubs will play a big part and instrumental part in it. We modeled it after the Brookings Institute and their findings. The first innovation hub was actually in Silicon Valley. So it's lessons learned, how did they become so successful, and how do communities across the country and globally perform with their success? What we found is Tempe already has an innovation ecosystem. Our past council and mayors have investments, and our current investments have been in economic, physical, networking. We have our Tempe Town Lake, our light rail, our streetcar. We've got the future IDEA Tempe campus. We have the Arizona State University, the biodesign. We have various entrepreneurs working here. It's a whole network of systems. So our ask is that we connect these systems together with the innovation hubs. We want to apply, like you mentioned, Mayor, the character areas. We feel that character area planning is key for all the decisions that we make because we've already done the outreach to the communities, and we want to take what they've said at their meetings and apply it to different plans that we bring forward to you. What's especially important is to enhance our transportation and connectivity. Transportation is key for this. And I think with the conversations that you've had tonight for our downtown core, transportation, our ridership will improve with more jobs we bring in that we have. Once those jobs start coming in and we have the community coming in by light rail in the streetcar, and we have these hubs in place, you know, Mayor, as well as I do, and maybe other council members, I get developers coming to me all the time asking, where do we go besides the lake and downtown Mill? Where can we go invest? Well, we hope that you're going to be able to say that it's the innovation hubs that will help you out. Currently, within the past year, we've noticed in the region, we've had ASU Novus Innovation Corridor, Mesa Innovation District, Phoenix Warehouse District, Scottsdale Airport Corridor, Phoenix Kierland, Tucson Warehouse Arts District. All of them have a specific purpose of what their goals are for these districts and their innovation hubs. Most of them are at the beginning phases. The infrastructure isn't at place, but they do have a vision for these areas for development as they go along with business attraction, retention, and expansion. Tempe is different, however. We feel that we have many corridors with innovation. It's not just one district. We feel that innovation is available over all our employment centers, and these employment hubs actually model after the character area planning. These cores are already established cores. They're all different. Lake District is different from the Hardy District. We've got new development versus old general industrial. I want to mention this is not a rezoning. This has nothing to do with zoning, but mostly a vision of how we can build our densities up, how we can get more ridership on light rail, and how we connect our uses together to form hubs that are sustainable and that can attract the millennials that work within our community. They want to live, work, and recreate. They don't want to be driving an hour to work. If they find a hub that's really intriguing to them, they're going to want to live there. Hey, I work just down the block, and that will be important to them.
One thing I want to, this is a very important slide, and talking with my colleagues at GPEC and working with Donna, look at the diversity of that slide from north to south. That's something that should not go unrecognized, because we're truly encapsulating the entire city and having these points of these areas identified. So when potential companies come and these are site selectors actually, when they start coming, they're looking at the valley. We've been very focused on trying to let the site selectors know where's a good place for them to fit. And you see this happening throughout the entire city, not just in the downtown area. But as you see on the agenda later on tonight, we're going to be talking about Broadway Road and that corridor. So it's exciting to see the fruition of the vision that we've happened. And just thanks again, Donna, for doing this, because it really, truly is exciting. We really do, and we've heard this earlier tonight, we have something special here.
We do, and as Councilman Navarro mentioned about Chicago, Chicago has all their concepts. It's David Burnham, an old planner there years ago. It was the Emerald Necklace is what they call it, Emerald Chain, connected through parks and services. There's the North Shore, there's Michigan Avenue. Everybody can identify with each district, and that's what we're hoping to do here. It's already established. We just need to connect the dots as we move forward. And you mentioned Broadway Corridor, Mayor. We see that's an exact area where we need to pay attention to, because it's a connector between our I-10 and to the 101. There's redevelopment opportunities there. And when developers come in to talk to us, I present some of Hanson's work that he's done in the past on the current character areas. They're very impressed, especially when Northern Trust came through and I presented the different areas of town they can work with and showed the work that we did. They're very impressed. So now we could take it a step further and say, well, here are the employment hubs within the character areas and tie everything together. The multimodal transportation is key, anywhere from the airport to the light rail, streetcar, rapid bus, going down to the orbit routes are very important. So I really want to stress that. I know it's in our long-term planning, and that's what this is. But the orbit routes, bringing employers to where their destination is, or they can just ride on an orbit to work, or from school to work, or whatever. That is a very important factor when I talk to major leading-edge consultants and companies coming into Tempe. But we also hear, if you noticed, ASU's Novus District, and they also have the ASU Research Park. We've been working with ASU. We've been working on this plan for over a year, and ASU has been a very collaborative partner on this. And future plans are for us to go out when we do, say, for example, market our IDEA Tempe campus. We're also marketing ASU Novus District. We want to give opportunities. We want to say where there's collaboration. We have ASU Biodesign. It's a synergy here that we like to play off of, and that's what's going to be to our advantage long-range planning on this. This also helps us with grant funding. If we can identify that we have a vision, that we have different areas in different parts of town, some are in the lower census income tracts, we can go out and get some funding for it. And if we show that we have a plan in place and the reasons why we have this plan, it's very helpful for us. It helps land values. some of the older parts of town, Smith Industrial, and then the Hardy Industrial. This may encourage land values because we want to add uses, and we'll go through that through this presentation. But there is a plan and strategies behind us, and like I said, working with other departments and consultants on this. We think we want to bring forward something that really can make a difference in not only Tempe, but for the region. We wanted to introduce to you tonight, and mentioned in your packet, is a pilot project for the innovation hubs. And I believe you can see from this map, just from what I've told you with our physical, economic, and networking assets that we have in place, this map is full of it. All of those and all of above. We have ASU for our education component, the Tempe for Tempe Marketplace for entertainment, retail. We've got sports venues around us. We have housing to the south. This project goes from McClintock to the east to the 101. We've got our transportation network. It goes from Rio Salado Parkway down to University Drive. You know, we have future transit line for Rio Salado Parkway, the streetcar. This is right for not redevelopment. We want to keep the zoning here. So again, I want to emphasize, we need to retain the GID zoning in this area, but how can we build upon it? How can we bring densities here? How can we bring ridership for the rail? How can we connect South Tempe through North Tempe to Tempe Marketplace? All questions that we can answer once we get the Innovation Hub established. Moving forward on this too, with not only the uses, but playing off of the Innovation District to the west of us is a key part of this as well.
Stay on that slide. All right. Mayor, council members, Hunter Hansen, Community Development. I'd like to kind of briefly explain the genesis for this pilot project recommendation, and then we can delve into some details on our pilot project recommendations. You can see with this map that contextually there's a lot going on. Everything from the new announcement for the funding for the Phoenix Rising Stadium and their mixed-use project to the Novus Innovation Corridor, Mesa Riverview, and of course our future streetcar expansion study right now. You can think about this area in terms of three pillars that we're going to explain here that informed the pilot project. The first is transportation, second is our general plan, and the third is the recent development of the character area plan for Apache.
And one more comment to that slide too. Another reason why we selected this site as the first pilot project is we look at the vacancy rates across the city. We all know that the Mill Avenue lakefront is 1 to 2% vacancy rates. We've got good vacancy Class A office space, but in our industrial areas, it could be up to 24% vacancy rate. So what can we do to help our existing businesses and future businesses? And that's what this is about, and the outreach will come down the road, but it's to help the community within that's existing.
That's a good point. And part of that capture program, that outreach, is also focused on the communication of our investment as a city in terms of our transportation infrastructure. That includes everything outlined in the Transportation Master Plan, both 2020 and 2040, with the addition of the recently announced high-capacity transit study, which is jointly endeavored by the City of Mesa, Phoenix, and Valley Metro. That will look to connect our current starter portion with the Mesa Riverview area. And of course, Mesa just announced their study area with Chandler for a north-south piece. So you can see how all these pieces are starting to really come together. This area for the pilot project also includes future bus extension service increases for adjacent routes, kind of frame the study area, as well as streetscape improvements, bike lane, intersection safety improvements, and most notably, one of our bike boulevards identified, which is the reflector route, pictured there in orange. We have funding secured for the southern portion, which extends on the Country Club alignment, which is the same as Smith Road, the Country Club alignment from the Chandler border to the 60, and we will be looking to secure funding for the fiscal year 2023-24 to connect the US 60 to Rio Salado Parkway. And the recent Rio 2100 project just connected that piece, which goes to the pathway on the lake, which connects Phoenix and Mesa. So that grid is literally will bisect this pilot project in half. So second of the two pieces here is the vision outlined in General Plan 2040. There were three references to this part of the city. It was identified as a land use hub at the interchange of the 101 and 202, also as a growth area in addition to the industrial revitalization area. The framework for that really goes back in three phases. First, we were really trying to clean up a brownfield site that was a county island. So securing the county island, developing Tempe Marketplace, Phase 2, now with the realization of Rio 2100, is kind of the phase 2 of the 67 acres of the areas just east of Marketplace. And the phase 3 mentioned in the general plan is the thoughtful redevelopment of the industrial area and how that could support our investment in transportation, say along Rio Salado Parkway, to get those ridership numbers up, which is a key determining factor that the feds look at in terms of grant sourcing. In addition to the proximity we mentioned with all of the other activities happening around this area. With our recent outreach on the Apache Character Area Plan, we took a year-long approach with area residents and stakeholders, and we continually heard from them the importance of this area. Right now, if you think about where people live and where they shop and eat and entertain themselves, this area is really thought as a cut-through for the area residents, say they're in the Apache area. They kind of, a lot of their neighborhood goods and services were displaced by the construction of Tempe Marketplace, so they go there to fill their prescriptions at Target and run errands and go to the movies. So when we think about the development of the streetscape of Smith, reinforcing those north-south connections between where people live and where they spend their time and money and free time is really important. That was one of the overarching goals of the Character Area Plan. The other goal was to maintain the industrial land use piece, because that is essential for the city to have that component, and then kind of build on that, to triangulate that, to grow that culture, which we're going to talk about in a moment here. Okay, so what would that look like? We started to do kind of an existing conditions analysis of this area as a whole. So on the left side of the screen is our current assessment. We have primarily single-story, single-use buildings. Those were built out from post-war through the 70s, so many of those buildings are at or near their life cycle. And the entire area is zoned general industrial, which includes warehouse, wholesaling, offices. We continually heard through our character area planning process, what's the city's vision for this area? What's the plan? What's our plan as these buildings are, 50 plus years old? What's going to happen next? So if we were to think about maintaining that industrial land base as the benchmark, and then incentivizing developers who maintain that industrial land base with the addition of, say, light industrial, which includes primarily offices, the laundry list there in the second column. And then the other portion of that is to think about complementary land uses. One of the most complementary land uses for vertical mixed use is, of course, office with residential. It has an opposite time of day use, opposite parking demand model, and wouldn't we all rather live on top of an office than, say, a restaurant? So you think about that compatibility of land uses. It also goes to heavily support our city's investment in public transportation and infrastructure. Okay, so what would that look like? Going back to the innovation ecosystem, one of the three tenets there is the physical environment. So it's very important that an innovation hub, when we looked at the examples around the country, that the innovation hub communicates cleanly that this is an area that companies choose to innovate, they choose to invest. So it's a marked point of departure from our suburban environment. It has to look and feel and communicate that technology and innovative thought and creative class industry chooses to locate here. So the look, the feel, the texture is essential. It's been said that good design is obvious and that great design is transparent. So a well-designed environment that's walkable, well-connected, we've talked about through our transportation pieces, is really kind of at that root of the innovation ecosystem. So getting the physical environment right, the architecture, the building materials, the form, the landscape treatments, they all need to work harmoniously to communicate that this space is different. And then it communicates that there is an environment in Tempe where innovation thrives.
Mayor, members of council, my name is Elisa Lyons. I'm the CEO of the Discovery Triangle Development Corporation, and I had the pleasure of working on this project on your behalf. I want to give you an overview of the Smith Industrial Hub as it is today. It's about a half square mile. Don already gave the dimensions and the boundaries of it. It's a very active area right now. There are active and successful businesses that the city will want to make sure they retain and have opportunities to expand in the Smith industrial area. But there is redevelopment opportunity. Currently, one of the reasons it should be, we believe, so attractive to new businesses and expanding businesses that are already there is the proximity to other assets. specifically transportation corridors, future planned mass transit opportunities, as well as entertainment entities just to the north. Unfortunately, the area does have a lack of infrastructure. Major new development in the area needs to be bolstered by a city investment from an infrastructure perspective, as well as the fact that a number of the buildings are older stock, mostly single story, and so over time, if the private sector market chooses, there could perhaps be some density added to the area, not only from a commercial standpoint, but also from a residential standpoint as well. Oops. One of the greatest parts about this project was the identification of some gems in the Smith industrial area, local companies, locally owned companies that are thriving in this area. And I just want to talk about a couple of them. Vomeris, for example. Vomeris has come up with a technology that they insert into a wound to help it heal. It mimics the electrical current of the body. That's happening right there in the Smith industrial area. Another great story that some of you might have heard is about Rango Honey that's also just north of University. It's a family-owned and operated company. They started because they had a family member who was a special needs family member who needed to only have the purest foods. And as they went out into the regular market, they couldn't find that, so they decided to start their own. And honey was a very important part of that. Now they harvest from 1,500 hives across the state, and they're doing that work right here in the Smith Industrial Hub. These are the kind of companies and the others like them that we want to make sure we retain and encourage to stay and grow in this area. In addition to those job creation opportunities that have been created by local business owners, investors have also made significant improvements to the buildings themselves. You can see this look and feel of the industrial area has been modernized in a number of opportunities. The Circuit is a new opportunity, Tesla is new, but other businesses that are older have upgraded their look as well to further enhance this area. The kinds of companies in this area are very unique, but clustered very tightly. There are tech industries, bio industries, light manufacturing, and auto. And again, like I said, it's very important the city has a strategy to retain and expand those. But the idea is that we can also build on them to advance the mission of the Urban Core Master Plan that was just discussed previously. An example of a way that the city of Tempe can build on the existing businesses there and expand the presence is in, for example, the auto-related industry. This area has a remarkable number of auto-related businesses, collision, repair, those kinds of things. We want to make sure those successful businesses continue to be successful in that area. We don't want to do anything to discourage them from being there. But we think there's an opportunity to build on that from an innovation standpoint and from an education standpoint. The city of Tempe can forge relationships with education entities that can come in and build satellite entities right here in the Smith area to help the pipeline of employees improve their skills as well as the industry moves from a more of a metric basis to more of an innovation basis. In addition, we think that we can attract to this area, because of that base, component research, design, R&D, high-tech automotive manufacturing, simply because businesses have already chosen in that industry to come here, and we can build on that base. It's also very important, we think, from an education perspective, to help Tempe achieve its Achieve 65 goal. We do believe that this area has incredible redevelopment and public infrastructure opportunities. What we want to do is inspire the retention and expansion of these buildings and these businesses and attract new innovators. And we want to bring people to the area. We'll talk about that more in the next slide. We think that this area can tell the story of Tempe's ecosystem of inclusion and connection by creating shade and walkability, public art, and other things that bring people, not just businesses, to the area to make it more lively, more active, and more attractive. We'd like to present the idea of a pilot project to focus public resources on infrastructure to make this area even more interesting than it already is, and we'll talk about this. This is the idea of this pilot area, creating connections. As you can see from this graphic, to the south of this picture, bless you, is entirely multifamily housing. We have heard, or our understanding from the community is that there is a great interest from that community in getting to the entertainment of Tempe Marketplace, as well as potentially to the jobs that are going to be created in Rio 2100. We think that that can be further enhanced by creating a specific corridor along Smith to ensure that that area is both drivable and walkable and bikeable, to make sure that there is a clear connection. We also think from a secondary perspective, you can see there's a wishbone shape to the right that could also be a very interesting secondary route for those residents there, as well as others to the south of this area. In particular, we also think that the 5th Street crossbar could be an interesting opportunity to work with the business owners in that area to find out what they would like to do to help revitalize that area, what kind of walkability and shade opportunities they think would be meaningful there to help them grow and expand their businesses, and potentially attract new businesses to the area to support them as well. One of the other key elements in here is, you'll see they look like little gears. Those are representing gateway features. The idea is that as you come into this area, you will know is something special, and that you'll see that both from the north, the south, and through the center. So that's something that we believe is very important in the branding of this area as the city continues to invest.
We believe by growing these hubs to become more urban, more accessible, and activate the hubs will be a great difference to our future businesses. Building on the general plan character areas will create innovation hubs, and with this pilot project to attract technology companies, creative employees, and visitors. We believe that developing connectivity from this hubs, the pilot projects is existing Tempe residents, but we also want to add potential residents to the area. Densities is key to get ridership and to get that retail component activated. We want to forge partnerships with innovators and educators to begin and enhance the area's innovation base, and by doing this, we'll add tech companies, aerospace, biotech, and light manufacturing is what we hope to enhance. This meets all the strategic goals and the priority goals for the council, whether it's safe communities, strong communities, sustainable communities, quality of life. It fits all of them, especially fiscal stability. Our next steps, we'd like to get your support for this to include it in the Urban Core Master Plan, both the hubs and the Smith Industrial Innovation Pilot Project. We want to continue to look and evaluate and pursue the congestion mitigation and air quality improvements grant funding for the Smith Hub Pilot Project. We want to really study the Broadway corridor. We want to explore orbit opportunities. We've been talking to arts and culture. They want to help us seek grant funding for this pilot project. Most importantly is our education. We want to take staff and get out, boots to the ground, if you will, to look at this hub and to start connecting more with the businesses and to see how we can foster the retention and expansion of their businesses. We would report back to you and following up if we got any grants and any art projects that may be coming over here. We may warn you, additional positions may come through our budget process for this. These are ideas and concepts that we really believe is important to advancing the economic growth for the city of Tempe.
Thank you. I think this is exciting. One of the things that I was worried about, and you've kind of eased it, is we don't want to push out the industrial uses, because part of the viability of our city is having a diverse mix of industrial parks with commercial and residential retail. That's one of the beauties of the way Tempe has been planned over the years. So keeping that, I think, is really, really important. I like the idea of the plan of the innovation hub. I think it fits what we're looking at. One of the things I would hope we would do, and I'm sure you would do it, is make sure when we do the outreach to those existing business owners, we're trying to help them, because if you start talking about widening sidewalks and closing the street, making the streets more accessible to other areas of modes of transportation, it may have some pushback from an industrial area because they may need it for the trucks and so forth that get delivered. It's got to be a good compliment, if you will. I think they'll see the vision. It kind of reminds me of when we did the widening of university, and some of these businesses were so upset. I'm like, we're adding value. We're putting in, all we had to do is sit down and talk to these residents about cutouts to make sure they can get to the business. Then once they understood what we were doing, they looked at it. It was an improvement for some of these businesses on the south side of university going west. So this kind of is like the same thing. If we're up front and communicate how important it is that we communicate And this is the improvement, the benefit of their existing properties, and seeing that we're trying to attract more industrial uses that fit within this. You know, as Alyssa mentioned regarding the auto industry and some of the programs that we could piggyback off of, I think that's exciting, that if we can look at it that way. And then the residential component, I think would be kind of interesting. I'm curious to see. I mean, that really could be really cool, but it'd be kind of interesting to see how that pans out. Councilman Navarro?
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I can't just tell you guys thank you enough. This is outstanding, the thoughtful presentation, the fact of detail. Hanson, I appreciate it. You know, you always got my attention when you think about the detail of landscaping and the walkability and all the minutia that goes along with just making an area. I just totally enjoy. I think it's so cool because it is a strategic like island, so to speak, where you can really innovate to every level, to where I kind of imagine it as a place that people will look at to where you can test everything, so to speak. And one of the things that came to mind, and we've talked about obviously we do great things within areas, and it just has an effect on values and stuff, and people are attracted to it. There's a bit of affordability within that area that would help out, and even down to a thought process of helping homeless. If a homeless area that was, how would I say this, is a first start to connecting with those business owners of people that want to stick with the criteria to succeed and to try to find advancement, to be qualified to be in that area, to have the connectivity, and the plus side of it too is they're located in that area. So they have the ability to get to those jobs if created by those partners within that area. And it probably wouldn't take much to do. You talk about automotive things and other innovations. There's an apprenticeship, so to speak, that can follow that. I think it's just an outstanding, because it's innovative. You're talking down even to the homeless area or homeless people, to be innovative for them. And maybe a small group at first, but it's something worth to like pilot. I really do believe. But I think with all of what you guys are doing, I think it's huge. Outstanding.
Any other comments? Yes, Councilman Cuba.
Just a question about, do we own any land in that area that might be possible for housing or for incentives?
Not in this industrial hub, but there is another industrial hub over by the Tempe Lake Districts on First and Hardy. And we're looking at workforce housing and maybe how to incorporate into a project that might be coming your way soon. So it is a key priority for us as we look at these, because we understand the necessity for workforce housing and lower bracket housing. So that's what we want to work into our projects.
One of the things that you touched on, the connectivity from the Apache neighborhood that you pointed out to the industrial hub to Tempe Marketplace. I think that's very key to that whole entire area.
Got to remember, there's 3,000 jobs coming in that once Freedom Financial builds out. So you're going to have employees that will want to be local, work in the area, ride the bus, ride whatever. So we're going to create that density right there just in that area, and that might be the pilot project we need for the other hubs.
Anybody else? Looks good. Move forward.
Thank you.
Make sure we do that outreach, and I'm sure you're going to come back to us and give us updates, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
All right. Next item, future agenda items. Anybody have any future agenda items? You want to take a break, or do you want to plow through?
Two more things, right? Come on. Yeah, let's just go through.
Okay. Next item is the call to the audience for the committee of the whole, listed under the section 4A and 4B. Audience members have up to 3 minutes to address the city council. If you'd like to speak on an item, please fill out a speaker's card and please hand it to our city clerk. And once that is, I will get your attention and you can address and move forward. I know, see, we have one card. And it is item 4A. Mr. Brian Korn. Please state your name, place of residence for the record.
Sure. My name is Brian Korn, and I live at 9202 South Heather Drive in Tempe, Arizona. Thank you guys for allowing me to speak about the pigeons in our neighborhood causing significant health and quality of life impacts for us. And I'm speaking really for my family as well as the neighbors in my neighborhood. since I sent some impacts and photos to you, Councilmember Granville, earlier today, so if you can pull those up later, that would be ideal. Bottom line, we have just an amazing number of pigeons. I know Councilmember Kubi came by our house and saw the impacts and saw just tons of birds and
Massacre.
the leaving. Yeah, it was just an amazing massacre, right? We're constantly having the problems with the birds in the neighborhood. It's amazing. Further research, we found we may be in violation or become in violation of a Maricopa County health, I think we spoke about that, a health department regulation. We're finding dead birds in our yard every day, or sorry, once a week or so. Our neighborhood several times a week or on the streets that are adjacent to us. It's dramatically affecting our quality of life, as well as our neighbors. We've tried to convince our neighbor to stop. You know, it's really the root cause of our situation. She's stated that she wants to feed them, and she's very happy to do so. She's purposely feeding these kinds of problematic birds. On another occasion, she said there's no law against it, so she can just pretty much do what she wants. Very problematic. We've contacted a company that does birth control, believe it or not. They said it was expensive, not joking. Birth control.
No,
You
it's
feed
very
them
effective.
birth control. I think they have the little pill packets and take care of that. But no, they said it's not likely to address the issue. Not likely to address the issue. It's extremely expensive. Take about 10 years to work, but we are welcome to try. Netting and trapping, really an inhumane option for the birds. They're going to die needlessly. And then poison is another option out there, and again, has the impact to other species, pets and such. Contacted pest services, again, expensive. They actually stated, about a half dozen companies we talked to, they said they wouldn't guarantee their work, and really they don't do this type of work in private residences. It's really businesses and farmlands. So really an audience, or why an ordinance? This issue was taken up by the city of Phoenix about a decade ago, about 10 years ago. 3 on Your Side actually then had a news program about it and showed that it was becoming effective in the city of Phoenix. And so when Councilmember Kubi contacted me, I suggested we look that route. You know, at the end of the day, I did notice some feedback came through the city of Tempe portal, and I read through all that feedback. About 37% of the folks are very, very strongly in favor of this. About 67 or 63% are not. But looking at that feedback, more than a third of those folks, really their concern is there's other things we need to look at in the city of Tempe. You know, maybe that's true, but for my health and my family and the neighborhood, it's a concern.
Right, you're gonna have to wrap your time.
Yep, no, that's fair. So thank you very much.
Your cross streets are where?
My cross streets are McClintock and Warner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, next we have Emmeline, how do you pronounce your last name? Emmeline Altschul. Okay, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. I just wanted to talk about the pigeon ordinance as well. I wanted to respond to some of the comments from the survey. They're worried that they're going to be affected because they have a bird feeder in their yard or something, and that is really not the audience of the ban. It's, you know, it's for somebody who's pouring bags of feed all over their yard. That's very different, I think, than somebody who has a small bird feeder, right? And sometimes a pigeon will eat at it, and it does take 3 neighbors. So, I mean, you really have to, you know, if one neighbor's just picking on you, that's not a thing. They felt really bad for the birds too, like we're starving them, and I just want to make it clear that these are wild birds. She is not a, like, first, in our situation, I think how the rule is written, this is not for domesticated birds. She's not eating them or growing them or using them to carry messages, okay? And when you go to Yellowstone, they love the animals there, they love the bears, right? But you still can't feed the bears, okay? Like, personal rights issue. You should be able to do what you want on your property. I love that concept. I really believe it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you can have large pools of water that attract mosquitoes. That doesn't mean that you can let your yard grow to high heck, right? Because, you know, it affects the property values around you. And this is one of those issues. So yes, it's her property, but really the birds poop all over our yard, not on her yard. So convenient that. And we don't have an HOA in our neighborhood to help with this. Is this issue important? I know they were worried that you're addressing homelessness. I don't want to take away from that issue. That's a super important issue, but I don't think that banning feeding pigeons is going to affect homelessness. So I love that you're working on that. I'm really glad you're working on that, but I still want the pigeon feeding ban. And as Brian mentioned, the other cities have addressed this problem. This isn't just like something random that we've come up with. This has been addressed in I think, most major cities in the US. And also, I want to say what's at stake. It's just a fine. Okay, we're not trying to like destroy her livelihood or something, okay? And yes, we have tried to work with neighbor. I even gave her a hummingbird feeder to try to redirect the energy of feeding birds, right? So that didn't work. She's a really nice person. She just has to stop feeding the birds. Yes, and we have tried some control measures like putting laser lights on the roof, putting
Speaking of lights at
owls.
Christmas didn't help?
Yeah, they're Christmas lights. They are, and we have them only turn on during the day, though, so it doesn't violate another city ordinance, which is that you can't have Christmas lights at not Christmas time. So they are timed, so that way they do not affect the neighbors. But that doesn't do it. Yeah, so we tried the kind of non-invasive ways.
Your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is anyone else in the audience wishing to address any of the other items listed on the committee of the work study? Could you please get my attention of the committee of the whole items? Seeing none, I'll close that portion of it. Goes right into item 4A1, unlawful feeding and keeping of pigeons. Imagine that.
Imagine that.
Mr. Granville.
Yeah, I'll do a very short presentation. I'm not sure I could improve on what we just heard, but a couple of things I'll just say. First, I want to thank Councilmember Cubey. She was the one who initially started working with the neighbors. She wasn't on the committee because she's got a plate this big full of stuff, but it was nice that she entrusted Randy and I to do that. And also, of course, Randy's help was immeasurable. It's just, you know, nothing gets done by one person. So I'll just give you the quick rundown. I think the easiest way to explain this is with the photo, if we could just bring that up really quickly. So I think there's an assumption that this is a bird or two. That's the initial photo that we got. That is, you can even see the tire track of how, where the car was there, I think. And so that, I believe, is after 1 week, is what I think my recollection was. That's the weekly droppings. And then every week you hose it down. So we're not talking about a bird feeder. We're talking about a bag of food a week sort of thing out front. So I just wanted to put it in perspective of who we're actually interested in. And so looking at this, we initially looked, based on the suggestion of the resident, we looked at the Phoenix ordinance. We don't really have anything like the Phoenix ordinance here. So I wanted to, I think it always goes smoother if you work with something that you know and trust. And so we've had for decades, I believe, a barking dog ordinance, where if 3 of your neighbors are willing to sign an affidavit and willing to testify, then the city will come out and they'll issue you a nice letter, and then after 30 days, if you do nothing about it, they'll issue you a simple citation about your barking dog that won't be quiet. It's not a heavily used ordinance, but for the neighbors that are surrounding it and that are being annoyed by a dog that barks day and night, it's a useful thing. So I thought, we've never gotten any complaints about that. Nobody said that it was being, punitively implemented. So I thought, all right, well, we'll just take the exact same thing that seems to work and just apply it to pigeons. After working with Jeff Tamilevich, his concern was he didn't want to be the species checker for a living, which I think is a very fair thing. He didn't want to, be checking for pigeons versus whatever. And so he said, could we just do it as a general feeding of birds? And so to go to the concern that I think we got in some of our feedback was does this mean I'm not going to be able to feed my birds? No, 100% no, that is not what this means. The same way that it would say, like, you can't have a barking dog. Of course you can have a barking dog. That's what dogs do, right? And people have bird feeders, and we're absolutely fine with that. The issue is if you're doing it in a way that is so out of conformity with the norms of your surrounding community that your surrounding neighbors agree, just like with the barking dog ordinance, then maybe it's something more than the bird feeder or 2 in the backyard. Maybe it's, the bag of food out on the driveway once a week. And so that's where we got to. Other than that, I think the people that came and spoke did a very eloquent job. And so again, this is a minor issue unless you're the person who lives next to this every 7 days. Then it's the biggest issue that we deal with. And so I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Any thoughts or comments from the council? Councilman Cuby?
So I witnessed the debacle, and I admit to like knocking your door and just sort of judging and going like, what are these people doing? How many birds are they feeding? And it was across the street, actually. It wasn't next door, which was surprising. And I mean, I'm really interested in developing a solution that really solves this problem. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, and we did sort of skip a step and not do the public forum. I thought that was kind of a requirement of any ordinance or ordinance change we do.
If I could answer that, Mayor? Yeah. We actually did 2 things. We did an online thing, which is where we got all the survey results from, and we also went to the neighborhood commission.
No,
the neighborhood commission gave its resounding support for it.
I think it's great that you went to the neighborhood commission and the online forum. I thought we had established that it was a new standard, and I know in work groups I've had that I had to we had to stop and go back and do a public forum about it. And there also was, usually in our working groups, we have a stakeholder process where we meet with some of the affected neighbors possibly, but also stakeholder group, like the Humane Society of the U.S. does have a real plan about how urban areas can deal with pigeon control. It's not just, this is a larger issue than just you. I mean, it's very much a problem for you guys, but it's a larger issue in terms of cities and public places and uncontrolled pigeon populations. And that birth control, actually, it may be expensive for a resident, but it's not necessarily expensive for a city. And they're not little IUDs or anything, but it's oh gosh. There's little pellets, and actually they cause a reduction in the bird population, so the cost of the food goes down because you're reducing the population. And it happens pretty quickly. It's been pretty successful in Hawaii. So the Humane Society of the U.S. has a whole plan for how urban areas can deal with pigeon problems in terms of the feeding the birth control kibble, and feeding or seed, it's kibble actually, and also the kind of structures you can create so they don't really like to rest or nest on them. So if we're going to tackle this problem, which we should, I think it's a little more complicated, that we need to look at the urban spaces. As we grow as a city in the urban areas, we have a lot of problems with pigeons just in the downtown area. But also I think we do need to go to the stakeholders, to an avian expert, and the Humane Society of the U.S. has worked with us in every animal protection or any animal control issue, and it would be good to get their feedback before I'm not ready to say, yeah, this is it. Because also the dog regulation, there's been complaints about the dog regulation not really being that effective, and it puts the burden, the burden is on the residents and not sort of on the city to help resolve the problems. You have to get 2 other neighbors and pit against, it's not so great for neighborly relations, but it can, actually, I got one of those citations for my barking dog, but he's gone now, so don't have to worry about that. I think we should, I think we need to just have you need to have another meeting and just have a stakeholder meeting and a public forum where people can weigh in more.
Can I ask a question from staff, or maybe Councilman Graham may know this? Was the public forum, was that done before or after it went to the Neighborhood Advisory Commission?
Candidly, here's what happens, right? Is we write the stuff, and I go to Parrish and I say, look, I don't want to go awry with anything. What are we supposed to do before this comes to council? And Parrish says, oh, we need feedback. And I go, okay, go talk to Andrew, find out what feedback we need. Parrish goes and talks to Andrew or whoever, and we do the things that we're told to do. There was no intention to.
My point is to Councilman Cuby's point. First of all, I hear, I'm in your neighborhood a lot, actually. That's why I know about the Christmas light string and the Eatons that live across the street from you. So, because of our daughters. But I'm very familiar with the area. I'm there a lot. But more importantly, I share your concerns. But to Councilman Cuby's point, what existing laws are in place from the county or the state that we could use? If there's 0, then I think having that feedback from the neighbors even more, because if you just look based on a survey of even they mentioned it was 67% against, like there's other things we should be looking at. That doesn't help these individuals out because it happens to live
all politics are local
on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So if there's a way that we could figure out, get some more, if there's another avenue, because I don't know, even by having this ordinance, how are we going to enforce it? What's going to happen? So that's one of the things that I think that we're looking at. If we could expand, get some more feedback, I agree with Councilmember Cubey, but knowing that it's an issue, what can we do to help these residents and then work with the neighbors? Councilman Shapiro.
Mayor, to me, there's two different issues that we're talking about here. One is if pigeons are causing a larger problem in our city, and we therefore need to control the population. And the second problem is, this is what you're going to say? Yeah, the second problem is that on individual streets and individual neighborhoods, someone is attracting the pigeons that exist to come there and causing a nuisance to the surrounding neighbors. I think what Councilmember Granville's trying to address is the second issue.
Yeah.
What Councilmember Cubey's talking about to me sounds more like the first issue.
We can separate it, yeah.
And again, I think they're very different. In terms of the second issue, having looked at this ordinance, it's pretty basic and straightforward. And in terms of the enforcement, it's complaint-based. And if there's a complaint, and then I assume there's a warning, and if the warning isn't complied with, there's a fine. So the enforcement seems pretty straightforward. I'd like to talk about addressing the first issue, but it seems like we have a solution to the second issue.
Councilman Navarro.
Yeah, I just agree with Councilmember Shapiro. I mean, I see it as two different issues. I see it as just a blatant, just over doing the norm, so to speak. And I loved how you guys phrased it. It's just out of the norm. Enforcement too. I was wondering about enforcement, and how big. These are one of those things where it's like, I don't think there's an issue on it. It's pretty obvious what's happening there and how to enforce it. If it makes the council happy to have some public input on it versus the internet or the survey online, fine. There might be some tidbit of this and that, but I have to say I think it's pretty straightforward.
So I think we should move forward with the ordinance, the second part that's being addressed tonight, but I think there's a bigger issue that Councilman Cubey brought up. I think we've all had that concern citywide. So I think if we could explore that with staff, I think that would be helpful.
And Mayor, if I could, I'd be happy to work with Councilmember Cubey on that as a separate issue. And if that takes us 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever to come back and do the second part and do it right, I'm happy to work on that. If you'd rather work with somebody else, I'm happy to.
It could be separate. I don't want to stop.
Why don't we move the ordinance forward?
I was just saying.
But I'm going to add something. Why don't we move the ordinance forward, but keep the work group instead of starting a second work group? Why don't you just keep the work group? If Randy wants to come off of it and Lauren wants to come on, great. But we don't need to go through a whole other Cal process again.
But I mean, there were a large number of people opposed, but as you represented, there was a lot of misrepresentation. I think it would be helpful with a, sort of a smaller, a public forum. You could just present, here's the FAQ, or do some step where like just sort of do an FAQ about the ordinance, because there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about it.
I concur with that as well. I think we all do. So we can get that information out on this ordinance to the Neighborhood Advisory Commission and through the neighbors and all the neighborhood chairs. I think that would be helpful.
So does that mean we're
So
moving forward?
there's consensus to move forward with this ordinance, and there's consensus to keep the working group to move forward to the bigger issue regarding.
Okay.
Not to do a public forum, just to.
No, I think we should have a public forum.
Mhm.
I think that should be part of the working group.
About the larger pigeon issue.
The larger pigeon issue.
The larger.
Yeah.
That's fine for me, Mayor.
Okay? We're good? Okay, move forward. All right, next is new items for consideration. Item B1, urban mixed-use redevelopment opportunities along Broadway Road. Councilmember Keating.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'd like to start a working group to look at, as we heard today, we're setting up these innovation hubs throughout the city, and Broadway corridor is going to be a critical piece of the connectivity between those innovation hubs. It's already a critical corridor in our city, connecting the I-10 to the 101. It's sort of the de facto start of our downtown area. As you come in from South Tempe, once you hit Broadway, you kind of know you're in downtown Tempe. So I really would like to identify urban mixed-use redevelopment opportunities along Broadway Road, connecting the innovation hubs and creating a sense of identity as one enters Tempe from I-10 and the 101, possibly do some placemaking along Broadway as well as we move forward with our innovation hubs.
Great. I called you earlier. If I could be a part of that, I'd love to work with
Absolutely.
you.
Mayor,
Councilman
I
Navarro?
would like to tag along. I don't know if I'll be much, but I think it kind of fits along with a lot of the streetscapes and a lot of the stuff that I've been working on in the past, so, yeah.
I think this is a great idea.
Great, thank you.
Everybody okay with it? All right. With that, any other items? Next is items 4C, which is items in progress. Anybody have any updates? Seeing none. I just have one announcement. Please welcome Brianne Fisher. She's a new mayor's aide to the city. Welcome, Brianne. She comes from Safford, Arizona. And she's an alumni from Arizona State University.
Yeah.
Go Devils. Via Safford down south. She chose well.
You can go to EAC.
Don't forget this Saturday, we have the City of Tempe night for ASU basketball, or ASU Day, or City of Tempe Day, I guess it's a day game. Make sure we go to that. And tonight, we do have our Geeks Night Out. That's where Councilman Vice Mayor Arredondo Savage is. And Mr. City Manager, do you have any announcements?
Hayden's Ferry Days is.
Oh, my gosh. Hayden's Ferry Day starts Friday. It goes how many weeks I think it goes? It goes.
Hayden's Ferry Weeks.
Well, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Yeah, well, it's this weekend, it's all week. I think it's all month. And it's exciting that we have, if I can open my calendar, I can get to it. This Friday night, we do have a Hayden Ferry's Founders Day dinner at the Hackett House, which is open to the public. And on Saturday, don't forget, we do have Tempe Cares. That project starts. It's going to be, the kickoff is at Broadmoor Elementary School. And then we also have two grand openings of our parks. We have an Arredondo Improvement Parks meeting, and we do have the grand reopening of Scudder Park this weekend as well.
Wow. Yeah. Didn't know that. When is that? Scudder Park?
Scudder Park is at 9 a.m.
Tomorrow?
Tomorrow?
Saturday.
Saturday. Thanks.
That's your report.
Tempe Cares.
Right after Tempe Cares, we head over to Scudder. And then we have Hayden Ferry Days. That's at the History Museum. That's starting at 10 a.m. And then we have the City of Tempe ASU men's basketball game for our city employees and our residents at 12:30. Mr. Manager, do you have any questions?
Good, thank you.
With that, we're adjourned.